With the battle having begun, Berenger rapidly loaded his rifled musket before taking off another shot at the oncoming attackers. His projectile struck through the abdomen of an oncoming levy, bursting it apart and sending the man grievously injured onto the ground below, where he slowly bled to death. Right after doing so, an arrow was fired upon him from below and glanced upon his steel skull cap. If it were just a few inches lower, it would have pierced his eye. Berenger quickly took cover behind the merlins as he began to reload his musket again. His troops were operating under the orders of fire at will, and as such, the firing sequence was sporadic, as cannons went off at different times, and muskets followed in suit. Eventually, a group of levies made it to the edges of the walls, where the defenders began pointing their muskets through the machicolations and unloading their lead projectiles onto the poor souls below. Now that the enemy was directly below the defenders, the thousands of infantry who still wielded the 1417 land pattern musket, which was smoothbore and thus had limited range, were able to engage the enemy behind the safety of the walls. The screams of the enemy filled the air as they were blasted apart by cannons and muskets alike. Despite the devastating fire which was rained down upon them, some ladders eventually made their way into a position where the defenders closest to them fixed their bayonets and pierced through the levies' chests who scaled the ladders. Due to a lack of armor, the bayonet thrusts were extremely efficient at piercing through the levies' chests, and the bodies were kicked down from the ramparts and onto the forces below. Eventually, the ladders were pushed back down to the ground below, crushing some of the men in the massive horde that attacked the city's walls. Surrounded, the defenders rapidly fired their muskets as quickly as they could, each soldier getting off roughly 3 shots a minute into the pool below. Without any way to defend themselves, it had become a turkey shoot. The defenders stayed behind the cover of the merlins and fired into the mob of peasants and men-at-arms who kept pressing forward, trying to get out of the firing zone of the mighty cannons. Despite the attackers nearest to the wall being within the cannons' blind spots, they were unfortunately within the line of sight of the musketeers due to the machicolations, which provided the ability to fire directly down on the enemies below while being protected by the stone walls. With over 3,000 infantry firing 23 rounds per minute, the defending forces could fire over 9,000 rounds per minute onto the forces below, who numbered roughly 15,000 in total. Though not every projectile hit its mark, it took only a matter of minutes before a sea of corpses had filled below the castle's walls. The level of chaos and carnage wrought upon the besiegers in such a short time span was unimaginable. The nobles were terrified by the powerful weapons in which Berenger's forces wielded and had already fled to the edges of the battlefield. Their armies were nearly annihilated. Even the heavily armored men-at-arms could not resist the might of the thunderous weapons in which Berenger and his armies were equipped. These noblemen were the children and vassals of the mighty barons and viscounts that had marched off to war with Lothar. They came to the conclusion that Berenger's rebellion was fated to end in an overwhelming victory. Witnessing death descend upon the battlefield as they had, they finally realized the reason why Berenger was so rapidly able to conquer cities. They highly doubted whether the stone walls of the era could defend against such overwhelming firepower. Without realizing they were still within the range of the cannons, the commanders gathered what remained of their army and began to discuss among themselves how to proceed. A man in his 30s dressed in full plate lifted the visor to his bassinet and spoke with a voice filled with trepidation. What foul sorcery has Berenger the Accursed conjured to produce such devastating weapons? It must be true that he consorts with demons if such destructive power lies in his hands. How could we mere mortals defeat the devil and his representative here on earth? The lords who had gathered had not gotten a good view of just exactly how their armies were so quickly slaughtered. They merely heard the thunder and saw the blood and flesh of their men splatter across the battlefield, completely negating any armor they may have been wearing. It was as if Berenger had created an army of sorcerers and demons. For how could the average soldier possess such dominating force? Another lord agreed with the previous statement and added his own. We must flee quickly, or surely we will be devoured by the gates of hell. We must warn others of the demonic power in which Berenger possesses. However, before they could flee in haste, the thunder of 6 guns going off echoed in the air as their explosive shells landed upon the gathering of nobles and tore them asunder. Berenger smiled wickedly as he gazed through his spyglass. In under an hour, the siege had been lifted, and his enemy was torn to shreds. The commanders were all dead, many of which were the regents of the unconquered regions of Tyrol. This overwhelming bloodbath would allow Berenger to place a garrison within Innsbruck and move on to the depleted regions which refused to bend the knee to him and swiftly conquer the rest of Tyrol. Eckhard quickly approached Berenger and asked what he wanted to do with the remaining forces still within firing range of the cannons, all of which were completely shell-shocked after witnessing the deaths of their commanders and comrades in such a short period of time. "My lord, what shall we do with the remaining enemies?" Berenger's lips curved into a wicked grin as he gave his final command in defense of Innsbruck. Open the gates and have the cuirassiers ride them down." Seeing that Berenger had decided to silence the enemy to prevent any word of his advanced weaponry from leaking, Eckhard merely sighed as he saluted by pounding his fist on his breastplate. "It will be done, my lord." After Berenger's orders were given to the battalion of cuirassiers, who had up until now not been given a chance to display their might, the roughly 1,200 men mounted their horses before they rode out to butcher the 1,000 or so men who had already begun to rout. The heavy cavalry quickly caught up to the fleeing footmen and cut them down like wheat to the scythe. Not a single besieger had made it out of the battle alive, and Berenger once more displayed the lengths he would go to ensure his overwhelming victory in this war and all the wars to come. The more Berenger could prolong the spread of accurate information about his weapons, the longer he could maintain his overwhelming technological advantage over his enemies. While this defense was going on, another battle was taking place back in the heartland of the Viscounty of Kufstein. While Berenger was crushing his enemies who marched upon him, Count Lothar's forces had arrived within Kufstein. If the defense of Innsbruck were considered a bloodbath, then the siege of Kufstein would be considered a sea of blood. Theodoric was at the head of his armies. They had marched from Vienna to Kufstein for the last few weeks, while Berenger was engaging in defense of Innsbruck and the bloodbath which would be the result. Theodoric had just arrived in the Viscounty of Kufstein. They were currently in the barony of Kitzbühel, where they planned to lay siege to Kitzbühel before marching on the city of Kufstein. However, when they entered the region, they noticed strange forts in the pattern of stars protecting the local villages. As they got close, explosive shells had rained down upon their army, battering away at their forces. It did not take long before Theodoric and his forces began to panic. Wasn't Kufstein supposed to be open for the taking? Something was amiss, but they could not give up because of this incident. As such, Theodoric began to rally his forces, who were terrified by the mysterious weapons that bombarded their ranks. Theodoric immediately began to order a retreat from the village in which they had initially wanted to raid. Despite having overwhelming numbers, they could not get close to the village without losing hundreds of men, and as such, Theodoric commanded his troops. "Retreat! Fall back to Kufstein. Clearly, Kitzbühel is loyal to Berenger. We must regroup with Linda and her forces." Though this event was shocking, Theodoric could not fathom the possibility that Linda had betrayed him, and by extension her father. As such, he figured it was the act of the local baron who took his orders from Berenger. Explosive shells fired out of 24-pound siege cannons exploded upon impact, the explosive blast and shrapnel tearing apart the bodies of the men affected by it. The men were terrified by such destructive power and rapidly retreated towards the direction of Kufstein. With advanced defenses, a single small star fortress could protect the vicinity of the local towns and villages from invaders quite efficiently. If the army was willing to suffer more losses, they could have eventually taken the town and potentially even the fortress, but their main goal was to seize Kufstein and ransack it. As such, they abandoned the idea to raid Kitzbühel and the surrounding regions. Instead, they decided to place their faith in Linda. After marching for several more hours, the army, whose morale was greatly shaken by the previous events, arrived in the city of Kufstein, where to their surprise, the entire city was surrounded by such impressive fortifications that were similar to those which had wrought destruction upon their forces at the village they had just fled from. Luckily for them, the cannons did not fire upon sight, convincing Theodoric that his army of 5,000 men was truly welcome in the region. However, as he approached the city's gates, he noticed they remained shut shortly after. He noticed the distinctive silky strawberry blonde hair of Linda fluttering in the wind on the ramparts above. She was dressed in a black and gold dress in which Berenger had gifted her that looked like it was from the Tudor era, which had yet to transpire in this world. The sun glistened on Linda's porcelain skin and illuminated her peerless face, creating the illusion of a goddess protecting the city's gates. Theodoric immediately felt his heart race as he gazed upon the heavenly beauty, and as such, he put on a smile as he requested entry into the city. "My dear Linda, would you please open the gates so that we may enforce your father's rule over this rebellious region?" However, Linda's reaction to his words confused the old Viscount. She stared at him with a look of pity mixed with disdain, all while her angelic voice resounded in the air, commanding the defenders on the walls to unleash hell. Open fire. Thus the moment Viscount Theodoric heard those words spoken by the young beauty who he greatly desired, his heart sank into an abyss in the next second. The thunder of 1,000 muskets and dozens of 24-pound siege cannons went off, devastating the army of the 5,000 men. Linda quickly scurried off from the battlefield and allowed the men of the garrison to do their work. In his last moment, Theodoric realized that he had been tricked, that Linda had betrayed her own father and lured him and his men to Kufstein so that the enemy could weaken Count Lothar's forces. He had completely fallen for the trap, and his liege was entirely unaware of his daughter's betrayal. After realizing this, a musket ball pierced through the Viscount's bassinet and into his skull, where it turned his brain into mush before exiting out the other side of the helmet. With the advancement of the Star Fortress and the men on the walls protecting it, there was not a single area where the enemy could hide. They were quickly torn apart by musket balls, canister shots, and explosive shells. Their limbs littering the battlefield, alongside the remains of their corpses and the splattered meat paste of those unlucky enough to not leave an intact corpse behind. Without their commander, the army quickly fell into chaos. Some strayed towards the walls hoping they would be out of the firing line, others routed away and were blasted to bits by the cannons. Much like Berenger's defense of Innsbruck, the siege of Kufstein, if it could even be referred to as such a thing, was quickly turned into a sea of death. There was nowhere for these men to run within the confines of the Viscounty of Kufstein. Every village was protected by its own star fortress and a small garrison of men to defend it. To lay siege to the city of Kufstein, one would normally have to go through the path of these fortresses and first clear the way. However, if one were foolish enough to be lured into this trap, then they would have no choice but to fight their way out of the path of these forts. As such, the men who remained and tried to mount some offense against the city of Kufstein were quickly torn apart by the many muskets which lined the walls. Because the garrisons were not Berenger's field armies, and as such, were not the cream of the crop, it took them longer to load their weapon, and as such, the slaughter was prolonged in comparison to the bloodbath at Innsbruck. As for the souls who had routed back the way which they came, they would face fierce resistance from the many forts along the way, most of which had previously been tolerant to their march into the trap that was set for them. In the end, not a single soul who had entered Kufstein with the intent to invade was allowed to leave alive. Berenger had left the defense of the homeland up to the garrison commanders, and they did not disappoint the man. With the trap sprung and the enemy army annihilated, a quarter of Lothar's forces had died within Kufstein, a fact he would not become aware of for some time, one which would ultimately prove to be his undoing. For when Count Otto's forces finally made it out of the blizzard and into Vienna, a great battle would unfold, one in which Lothar would now be outnumbered due to the heavy losses he suffered here at Kufstein. After the battle was over and the area cleaned up, the gates to the city of Kufstein were once more opened, and as such, refugees from across the German-speaking regions began to arrive in Kufstein in search of a better life. Many of these people did not have the ability to bring anything of value with them as such, they were merely hoping that they would be welcomed with open arms. Word of Berenger's political reforms brought a great deal of interest among the common folk towards Kufstein. It had become a paradise in the minds of many who had never stepped foot in its territory. While the conditions they would find themselves in were vastly superior to the lives they had before, no doubt a life of labor awaited them. While Berenger was off at war, Linda was left behind to act as regent. This was a shocking revelation to the nobles who currently comprised of the House of Lords, who had been burdened with the task of ushering in Berenger's vision while he was away. Because Berenger had not found a suitable candidate for chancellor, which under his system would basically be the man he appointed to act as a sort of vice president whose vote would break ties in the House of Lords, and who would act as a temporary leader when Berenger was away, he had appointed the person he trusted most around him as regent, which was of course Linda. Currently, Linda was sitting in Berenger's office space where she was signing bills into laws. These bills were drafted specifically to handle the incidents with the growing refugees. Though they had previously had an influx of peasants fleeing their masters and entering Kufstein, it now seemed as if the entire world was fighting for a position within the city or the many towns and villages around. Berenger had previously set up a department of immigration that handled identity verification and assignment of labor to the newcomers. Currently, Linda was in the act of increasing their budget so they could employ more people to handle the ongoing refugee crisis. Though the city of Kufstein was designed with rapid growth in mind, she could hardly believe the costs incurred in finding appropriate jobs for these migrants and providing education for themselves and their families. Now that she was no longer pregnant, Linda could enjoy a glass of wine or a mug of beer now and then, and as such, she licked her lips as the delectable taste of red wine slid down her throat. It had been weeks since Berenger first departed for his war, and yet she had already begun to desire his return greatly. While she pondered about when her lover would finally come home, the door to the office opened, and Henrietta was standing in the doorway. Throughout the past 6 months, her relationship had gradually improved Linda. Though Henrietta would always be on Adela's side, she became accustomed to the idea of having a nephew, and as such, had been spending much time with the infant Hans, which resulted in some degree of amiability to form between herself and Linda. Considering the castle had become awfully lonely without Berenger or her parents around, she could only turn to Linda for socializing. Thus, the little lowly approached Linda, who was busy signing documents, and inquired about what she was up to. "What are you doing?" Linda sighed heavily as she put down her quill and smiled at Henrietta before answering her question. "I am managing your brother's affairs for him. With the war, plenty of peasants have come to Kufstein seeking a better life, and as such, I have to expand the Department of Immigration and the Department of Education. I also have to put many of them to work in building their own tenements, which of course takes time and money for these unskilled peasants to learn how to handle a job in construction properly." Yes, Henrietta really did not understand half of what Linda was talking about, but she pretended like she knew as she smiled and continued to chat with the woman she once despised. "Anything else?" Linda let out a heavy sigh one more and rested her weary head on her fist before complaining about all the work she had to do due to the war. "The arms sales have increased rapidly, thus generating sufficient profit, but I also need to expand the garrisons and raise new field armies for Berenger's war efforts. Though 5,250 men may seem like a lot, eventually, there will be losses, and those men need to be replaced. Thus I need to delegate a certain sector of the industrial district solely to producing arms and armor for our own forces. I seriously do not know how your brother manages to do this much work every day. It is exhausting." As such, Linda pulled out a flagon of wine and poured more of it into her chalice as she took another large sip from the golden cup. She was well aware of the massive army of Teutonic knights that was coming to their borders, and she needed to rally more troops for Berenger so that when he finished his conquest, he could deal with the church's forces. As such, she had begun a period of conscription where all male residents of Kufstein aged 16-20 were forced into military service for an undesignated period of time. This also applied to all migrants who made their way to Kufstein. As such, the numbers of Berenger's forces were growing rapidly, so much so that the arms factories could not keep up with the demand for the equipment needed to field and train the conscripts. Linda's problems were temporary once properly distributed to the regions and educated in the trades necessary for their careers. The Viscounty of Kufstein would gain a significant amount of benefits from this population growth. Luckily, they had implemented the four-field system and other agricultural advancements. As such, they had enough to feed the booming population without relying on imports, at least for now. Deciding she needed to take a break, Linda got up from her desk and walked over to Henrietta before suggesting, "How about we go take a nice hot bath? I'm getting sore from sitting in this seat all day." Henrietta smiled and nodded while agreeing that sounds fun. As such, the two girls absconded to the large bathhouse constructed in the castle, where they swam in a heated body of water the size of a small swimming pool. Linda would return to her mountain of paperwork after she had finished a brief period of relaxation. Berenger was currently sitting on the seat of power within Innsbruck. Kneeling before him were the surviving lords of northern Tyrol. Having lost their regents and the overwhelming majority of the forces they could muster in their disastrous attempt to retake Innsbruck, these men were left with little support to defend against Berenger's invasion. Seeing as how these men were in control of the nearest provinces to Berenger's forces stationed at Innsbruck, they knew their days were numbered and that Tyrol would soon fall into the hands of Berenger. These relatively wise men had traveled to Innsbruck to officially surrender the north to Berenger, and by extension Duke Wilmar. Berenger, who had a smug smile, was resting his face onto his fist while listening to the terms of surrender in which the lords presented. At the head of the group was an older man with long white hair and a matching beard. He was a lord who was the sworn vassal of the Baron of Landeck and was the man representing the interests of the dozen or so northern lords who had gathered to surrender to Berenger officially. The man kept himself standing with a cane and slowly enunciated his words. "Viscount Berenger, on behalf of the lords of northern Tyrol, we present the terms of our surrender. First and foremost, we will recognize you as the reigning authority of Tyrol until Duke Wilmar has defeated Count Lothar and decides on whether or not his family will remain in power. In return for this, we want you to leave our realms in peace and not bring your war to our doorstep. Enough blood has already been shed resisting your rule." Berenger nodded his head and smiled gracefully at the elderly man. "I accept this condition. Are there any more demands?" The elderly lord nodded as he continued to speak the terms that the nobility of the region had come up with to negotiate their surrender. "As you know, we have suffered sabotage to our food storages during this conflict. As such, we would request aid in regards to the crisis we are now facing in our lands." Berenger thought for a moment about this. While the harvest this year was exceptional for his territory, it was not to the degree where he could feed the other viscounties and baronies. It would be some time before he received such yields. As such, he would be forced to buy the grain at his own expense and transfer it to these lords. However, if he did not do such a thing, many innocent people would starve to death during the remainder of the winter, and he would be directly responsible for it. As such, he decided to bite the bullet and pay the expense to supply these regions. After all, he was waging war to gain territory and population to aid his growing ambitions. Losing a large chunk of the population of the lands he would conquer from starvation would greatly hinder his future progress. As such, Berenger nodded and agreed to this condition as well. "Very well, I will pay for your food stores to be adequately resupplied." "Anything else?" The older man nodded his head and spoke of his last condition. "If you win this war and successfully put down Count Lothar's rebellion, and the Duke decides to appoint Liutbert as his father's successor, we request that you honor this arrangement and do not act as a usurper. If you are truly waging war for the sake of restoring Duke Wilmar's authority to Tyrol, then you will have no problem accepting this condition." This put Berenger in a difficult position. If he accepted this request, and he was not rewarded with the county of Tyrol for his efforts, he would have waged this war in vain. But if he denied this condition, then he was essentially making it publicly known that he was actually nothing more than a usurper, and that would further embolden the remaining regions of Tyrol to continue to defy him, which would be disastrous as he did not have enough men to lay siege to every city and town in every province of Tyrol. He was relying on a few overwhelming victories at key provinces to force his enemies to the negotiating table. They would be much more likely to do so if they believed Berenger was acting in the interests of Duke Wilmar instead of himself. As Berenger tapped his finger on the armrest of the chair he was seated in several times before coming to a decision. After several moments of near silence, Berenger finally voiced his decision on this condition. "I accept. If that is all, then I hereby recognize the surrender of Northern Tyrol." Seeing Berenger accept the third and final condition made many of the other noblemen smile truthfully. Aside from the barons and viscounts directly under the vassalage of Count Lothar, most of the lesser noblemen who lived in Tyrol were not exactly supportive of Lothar's rebellion and had merely been following orders. With Berenger accepting the final term, they felt that he was sincerely acting as a loyal supporter of the Duke rather than a man who was using the current crisis to usurp the county of Tyrol for his own greed. As a result of this surrender, Northern Tyrol was temporarily under Berenger's control. He planned to be marching upon then Tyrol and Trent shortly in order to capture the remaining territory of the county of Tyrol. For now, Berenger had to think of a way to convince Duke Wilmar to revoke the title of Count of Tyrol from the von Habsburg-Innsbruck dynasty and appoint his own dynasty as the future Counts of Tyrol. Little did he know that when Duke Wilmar finally heard the news that Northern Tyrol had surrendered to Berenger after a little over a month of combat, he would begin to favor Berenger's abilities greatly and would become far more amicable to the idea of making Berenger and the von Kufstein dynasty the Counts of Tyrol. For now, Berenger was in the process of resupplying his forces and giving them a much-needed rest. It would be at least a week before he would march upon the south. Luckily for him, Linda had already implemented the process of conscription, and soon enough, he would have reinforcements on the way. It would only take 2 more months for several thousand more men to finish basic training. By then Berenger would be able to replace his losses, and even gain a significant boost to his army's numbers. Adela was currently within her room reading a letter from Berenger. Despite the fact that Berenger was off at war, he made sure to send letters to his women as often as he could, informing them of his massive victories in Tyrol. The teenage girl twirled one of her golden twin-tails as she lay belly down on her bed with a smile on her face. The news she was reading was excellent. The northern lords of Tyrol had all surrendered to Berenger, recognizing him as the current authority in Tyrol, and was providing him with what little support they could manage. Ever since her older brother Gerhard had made a fool out of himself and invoked their father's ire in his failed attempt to demolish the relationship between Berenger and Adela, the young girl had mostly stayed to herself. Aside from eating meals with the family, she would stay within the confines of her room and repeatedly read the letters Berenger had written to her. She wished she was in Kufstein to provide some aid to the man she loved, but unfortunately, she was in Graz for the time being. Though Vienna was under siege and her father was at war, Graz was in a state of peace, albeit one of vigilance. Oddly enough, Adela and Linda had been corresponding through a series of letters and had seemingly grown closer. However, there was still a rivalry between the two as they both desired to monopolize Berenger's attention for themselves. Despite this rivalry, there was some form of amiability among the two young women as they both discussed their concerns over Berenger's safety and desire to be with him again. After reading Berenger's latest letter for the third time in the past 3 days, Adela sighed and voiced her concerns aloud. "Stay safe, Berenger." Afterward, she heard a knock on her door and quickly stashed the letter away underneath her mattress before opening the door. In the doorway was her second brother Heir. The teenage boy was dressed in a baby blue doublet with a matching jerkin over it. His entire attire was set up in the fashion sense in which Berenger had introduced across the entirety of Austria, which greatly resembled the Tudor style from his previous life. There was a stern look on the handsome youth's face. His facial features were charmingly robust, much like Lambert's. He truly exemplified the archetype of a young knight. He was 17 this year and carried an aura of martial authority. Noticing the expression on Heimerich's face, Adela instantly became worried about what might have transpired to force the youth into such a state. Before Adela could ask what was wrong, Heimeric said in a grave tone, "Come to the Great Hall, I have news about father to report to the family." Adela knew something must have gone wrong if Heimeric forced her to meet up with her family in the Great Hall. As such, she quickly put on her slippers and followed her older brother to the Great Hall. When she arrived, she noticed the various expressions on her family's face, especially the anxious look on her mother Wanda's exquisite visage. The only person who did not appear to be worried among her family was Gerhard, who was rather upset that his position of regent was stripped away from him and given to his little brother. After Heimeric sat down upon the seat of power in Graz, he cleared his throat before making a declaration about the news in which he had received. "Father is currently on his way to Vienna. He was trapped in a blizzard within the Bavarian Alps for the past few weeks, which is why he was out of contact. He has lost a fifth of his forces due to attrition. As such, he suspects that he will be vastly outnumbered when he tries to take Vienna back from the traitorous Count Lothar. As for the state of Vienna, the castle has yet to fall, but the city has been completely taken and ravaged by the occupying forces. Father expects heavy resistance and has asked for our prayers." Adela's family immediately broke out into fits of prayer as they frantically prayed for the Lord's protection for the head of their household. The only member in the room who was not overly concerned about this news was Adela. This was because she was aware of the destruction of a quarter of Count Lothar's forces at Kufstein. After all, she had already been informed of the events that transpired by Linda. Though her father would have to lay siege to Vienna to defeat Lothar, he would have the advantage in numbers even with his losses from attrition. War was a dangerous business, and no matter how protected one might seem, anything could happen that might lead to their deaths on the battlefield. Thus the lives of their loved ones who were off fighting in some distant region of Austria were in the hands of the Lord, and they could only pray for his mercy. As a pious girl, Adela joined her family in prayer to the Lord to protect her father, as well as Berenger, as they both continued to fight for their family and nation. After being informed of her father's situation, Adela realized that she had the ability to aid in her father's siege by asking for support from Kufstein. As such, she returned to her room, where she quickly wrote a letter to Linda informing her of the current situation with Vienna. Due to Berenger's conquest of Tyrol, Adela doubted whether or not he would be able to receive her request for aid before it was too late. As such, she sent the letter to Linda, who she knew was currently acting as Berenger's stand-in within Kufstein. The letter contained a formal request for material aid to Count Otto's forces to eliminate Count Lothar and his allies at Vienna. Adela knew that Kufstein was in no position to split its armies and attack Lothar where he was at his strongest. However, she also knew that Kufstein's agricultural and industrial sectors were greater than any other region in Austria, and as such, she requested logistical support from Kufstein to her father's siege of Vienna. Adela was quite worried. Though she and Linda were no longer outright enemies, they were not exactly allies either. She was asking the young woman to act on behalf of her romantic rival to capture or eliminate her own father. Though Linda had already greatly betrayed her father in his schemes, those actions were on behalf of Berenger, who she was deeply in love with. Whether or not she would provide logistical support to Count Otto and his forces was yet to be determined. After signing the letter with her signature, Adela quickly handed it off to a messenger who would travel across the Duchy of Austria, where he would hand it off to Linda in Kufstein. Hopefully, the young teenage girl could receive Kufstein's support and greatly enhance her father's chances of victory and, more importantly, survival. At the moment, Berenger was standing in the great hall of Innsbruck surrounded by his officers. In front of them was a large table with a giant map splayed across it. Upon this large map were wooden figures acting as representations of Berenger, his allies, and his enemies. It had been roughly a month since Berenger first began his campaign to conquer Tyrol. After several overwhelming victories, he now found himself controlling roughly a third of the territory in which he had desired to conquer. Since the beginning of the war, when Berenger first left Kufstein, he had put in place measures to begin conscription. He knew his meager army of a little over 5,000 men was not enough to maintain control of Tyrol in its entirety, and as such had begun a new wave of recruitment designed to adequately train the conscripts in the use of firearms, line tactics, and basic combat maneuvers within a matter of weeks. Though it was not the Grand Army of Germany that he had envisioned for the future, his current needs required him to make some sacrifices in the training regimen and the equipment in which the conscripts would use. As such, Berenger had tasked the armories to manufacture the 1417 Land pattern musket instead of the more advanced 141718 rifled musket. At the moment, 5,000 conscripts in the form of infantry were waiting in Innsbruck alongside the veteran forces of Berenger's army. While they waited for their orders, Berenger was discussing with his officers the best path forward into the conquest of Tyrol. Berenger moved a set of infantry figures across the map and into the position of Sterzing, Meran, and Schlanders, which were the primary hubs of rebellious forces in southern Tyrol, before announcing his plan for a rapid conquest of his enemies to the men by his side. The plan is simple: these three cities are the key centers of resistance to my authority in Tyrol. With the aid of the armies of the lords who have declared their support for me, we will split our army into three components. I will take Sterzing, Eckhard will lead the forces to Meran, and Arnulf will command the men at Schlanders. In one single swoop, we will bring South Tyrol under our authority before moving on to Trent. Eckhard agreed with the plan but also had some concerns. As such, he decided to voice them at the moment. What about our position in North Tyrol? How many men will we leave behind to secure our interests? Berenger smiled as always. Eckhard did not lose sight of the big picture, so Berenger made a bold declaration. 500 men in Innsbruck, and 500 in Schwaz. As for the remaining regions in the north, establish 250-man garrisons to secure the loyalty of the lords who have pledged their support to me. Eckhard nodded in agreement. Though these were rather large garrisons, they would be able to adequately defend the regions from enemy sieges, especially with their technological superiority. Eckhard's next question was in regards to the artillery battalion. What about the artillery? Berenger had already developed a plan regarding the most efficient use of artillery, and thus he explained his plans to Eckhard. We will split the battalion into three separate batteries. One will go with each army to ensure that there is sufficient firepower at each siege to bring down the walls of the enemies. Listening to Berenger's plans, the officers of his army, largely comprised of the knights and nobility from Kufstein, had nodded their heads firmly in agreement. If they continued to act as a single army, it might take them months if not years to bring Tyrol completely under their control. Seeing how this campaign was only a smaller part of the civil war going across Germany at the moment, nobody wanted to spend that much time securing a small region like Tyrol. Arnulf, who had been listening to Berenger's words, had a single thought on his mind, and as such, voiced his concerns. What if Lothar returns from Vienna? It has been well over a month since he first began his siege of Vienna, and he should be close to victory by now. Berenger shook his head and responded to Arnulf's concerns with the latest information he had received. Lothar is busy defending Vienna from Count Otto, whose forces have arrived and begun besieging the city in an attempt to wrest it from Lothar's grasp. He and his armies will not be returning to Tyrol anytime soon, and if they do make it out of Vienna alive, their numbers will greatly be reduced. Hearing this news, Arnulf, and many of the other officers felt more relaxed about Berenger's plans. This three-pronged operation was nicknamed Operation Trident and would be a deciding factor in Berenger's victory in the war for Tyrol. As such, Berenger chatted with the officers for some time in great detail about logistics and tactics before finally ending this strategic meeting. Gentlemen, if all of your questions have been answered, then you should get some rest, for tomorrow at the break of dawn we will march upon our enemies. God with us. Immediately upon shouting that last part, the men all saluted Berenger and shouted the phrase which had become the battle cry of the armies of Kufstein. God with us. Yes, after ending the meeting in such a way, the officers returned to their forces to prepare them for the coming battle. With this, Berenger returned to his temporary quarters, where he sat down on the bed and sighed heavily into the dimly lit room in which he resided alone. I need to finish this war quickly so I can return to Kufstein and into the loving arms of Linda. After having such a thought, Berenger prepared himself for the night and then went to sleep, thinking not of the violence and brutality that he would soon be enduring, but of his 2 women and his infant son. He began to reminisce about the days of the not-so-distant past, which were far more peaceful than the ones he currently found himself in. It was hard to believe that he had only been reincarnated into this world less than a year ago. He had accomplished so much in this small amount of time, especially when compared to his previous life, where by the time he was 21, he was still at West Point achieving absolutely nothing in his life. Coming from a relatively poor background, he had spent his entire youth gaining the knowledge and grades necessary to get an academic scholarship so that he could attend a university. Ultimately, after several life factors, West Point became his best option, and so he begrudgingly chose to join the military. After graduating, he wasted his life away in the hellhole known as Afghanistan until his final days. In this life, Berenger was fortunate enough to be reincarnated into nobility. After getting his first taste of real power and wealth, Berenger had become incredibly ambitious, no longer desiring to simply industrialize Kufstein and retire in wealth and luxury. Now that he had a chance, he wanted to be like the many great men from history he had read about in his past life. Thinking of past, present, and future, Berenger fell asleep with a smile on his face. His conquest had only just begun. The light of dawn shone down onto the burgeoning city of Kufstein. The star-shaped walls that protected the city and its inhabitants were split down the middle as the river flowed through the center of the city. A large castle rose above the many tenements constructed in the half-timber style commonly found in the German-speaking regions. Though Berenger had plans to move into a more modern palace, at the moment, the Kastel in Kufstein acted as the main residence for Berenger and his family. Within the dining room, Linda sat at the head of the table at the left side, which was the spot reserved for the Viscountess. Of course, at the moment, there was no Viscountess of Kufstein since Berenger was unmarried, albeit engaged to Adela. However, since Berenger's parents abdicated and retired to the countryside, Berenger had allowed Linda to use the seat. Today was a rare occasion for the castle in Kufstein, for it held a rather lively gathering. Just this morning, her siblings arrived from Innsbruck, in which they had been transported to Kufstein under the guise of Berenger's protection. In reality, they were under house arrest, and Linda was watching over them. Aside from Linda and her siblings, Henrietta sat at the table and was greatly uncomfortable with the whole situation. Lietbert was sitting in the spot Berenger used to sit at before his reign, which was closest to the seat reserved for the Viscount, which was currently vacant. He could not help himself from staring at Linda with confusion. This was not the sister he had grown up with. There was no coldness nor contempt in her eyes for everything around her. Instead, she wore a gentle smile and gazed upon her family with genuine fondness. It had been many months since she last saw her siblings, and though Linda's relationship with her father was strained, to say the least, she was willing to try to get closer to her siblings. Eventually, Lietbert had to express his doubts over Linda's shift in character. "Who are you, and what have you done with my sister?" In the past, such a rude comment would have sent Linda into a fury, but now she merely laughed it off, as she recognized that her personality had changed greatly in the last year. Instead, she replied to Lietbert by asking about his meal. "How are you enjoying your meal, Lietbert? Surely the breakfast here in Kufstein is better than anything you have ever had in Innsbruck." Lietbert fell for the sleight of hand and quickly took a bite out of the breakfast sandwich the kitchen staff had prepared before responding to his little sister. "It is excellent. I did not know such fine cuisine existed." Linda chuckled at his remark and taunted him for his inexperience with Kufstein's culinary arts. "As if you think this is good, wait until you have had dinner. You will never want to leave this place." As Lietbert and Linda discussed the meal, Adelheid was glaring at Linda. She could not believe the changes in her precious big sister's personality over the past year. It was too dramatic, Just what sorcery had Berenger cast to make her once proud and domineering big sister transform into such a sorry state? However, she did not wish to make a scene and, as such, kept her thoughts to herself. Eventually, Linda's little brother Hermann interrupted the ongoing conversation and steered it into deep waters. He was scowling at his two older siblings and scolded his big sister, who he had once looked up to, for her lack of loyalty to the family. "I cannot believe you betrayed our father. All for that traitor Berenger, who as we speak is currently ravaging our family's lands in an attempt to steal away father's rightful title." Hermann was roughly the age of Adela. He had just entered his teenage years and was filled with intense rage every time he thought about his older brother's surrender at Innsbruck and his older sister's outright betrayal. After all, Linda not only slept with the traitor Berenger but had actively plotted against their family in support of Berenger's ambitions to him. His sister's actions were completely unforgivable. As Linda glared menacingly at Hermann, the boy clearly did not understand how wrathful Berenger could be. Luckily for him and his siblings, they were all allowed to live peacefully in Kufstein under house arrest, where they could dine on the greatest food and live in absolute luxury while the war waged on. Seeing his elder sister's fury, which he was all too familiar with, a cold sweat broke out on Hermann's forehead as he shivered at the thought of what Linda might do to him for speaking ill of her lover. He immediately shifted his glance back to the plate where he ate the omelette in front of him. Linda, however, would not let such an accusation slide by, and as such, she addressed Hermann's statement. "Why would I ever support father and his damned obsession with becoming duke? Since when had father ever paid the slightest bit of attention to us kids? Our entire lives, he has neglected us to pursue his dreams of being Duke of Austria, all because he has an inferiority complex about being part of the branch family and not the main Habsburg line. If you ask me, he deserves to lose his head for his treasonous actions. Berenger is not a traitor. Instead, he is the only one of father's major vassals who has enough of a conscience to act against father's illegitimate rebellion." Though Linda's words were harsh, they were also true, at least regarding the parts about her father. Count Lothar considered all of his children as disposable pawns whose sole purpose was to advance his ambitions. He was never much of a fatherly figure to his children, which is one of the reasons why Linda had turned out so poorly before she met Berenger. Though Linda was spoiled growing up, it was only a way for Lothar to coerce her into acting in his treasonous plots. The reason Count Lothar was so enraged about Berenger and Linda's affair was twofold. Firstly, the man saw Berenger as nothing more than low nobility unworthy of mixing with his family's prestigious blood. Secondly, Berenger had not only taken his daughter's chastity but also impregnated her, thus taking away the ability to make a powerful political alliance through marriage. Though Hermann wanted to defend his father's actions, he really could not find the words to do so. Instead, he sat in silence like a child who his mother had just caught with his hand in the cookie jar. There was a rift between Linda's family at the moment. This was due to the results of her actions and that of their fathers. As such, they continued the remainder of their meal in silence. This little family reunion turned out to be more awkward than any of them had realized. While Berenger was off at war, Linda was now tasked with not only looking after the affairs of the realm but also keeping a watchful eye on her family. Ultimately, the only member of her family who was completely on her side is her little half-sister Adelheid. At the moment Berenger and his army were crossing into the southern portion of Tyrol, his armies had recently split and headed in separate directions, and he was now in command of a force numbering roughly 5,000 men in total, half of which were his own forces. The other half of the army comprised levies from the southern lordships, which supported Berenger's campaign to put down Lothar's rebellion and recapture Tyrol from the traitorous lords who openly defied the authority of Duke Wilmar. Unlike Berenger's army, which was filled with the most veteran members of his infantry and cavalry units, the peasant levies were poorly equipped, and many of them had never seen a battle in their lives. At most, they would act as cannon fodder for Berenger's forces. Their role would be to soak up the enemy's missile fire while his troops gunned down the hostiles. At the moment, it was late in the morning but not quite yet noon. The wind was still, and all that could be heard were the sounds of thousands of feet marching to the beat of the drums as the infantrymen sang another one of Berenger's marching songs. After crossing through the frosty crags of the Alps, Berenger's forces finally found themselves in a position overlooking the city of Sterzing in the distance. However, to their surprise, they also saw an army marching towards them. It would appear that the enemy had opted to sally forth into the field in an attempt to intercept Berenger's forces and eliminate them before they entered the boundaries of the city. As such, Berenger shouted for his troops to hear. "Form ranks. His commands were passed on to the officers and the NCOs before finally reaching the enlisted personnel. With this command, the veteran forces of Berenger's army formed lines and began to load their weapons. The artillery battery also began to take an elevated position above the field below where the enemy army was marching. The cavalry did their jobs and took positions on the flanks, where they would soon be rushing the enemy army. There was no cavalry to speak of in the enemy's forces. In fact, much like everywhere else in Tyrol at the moment, the professional forces were all gathered with Lothar in Vienna, leaving behind small garrisons and large groups of levies to defend their homes. There were a few noblemen and knights, but they quickly dismounted from their horses the moment they saw the overwhelming number of cavalry Berenger had brought with them. As such, the cuirassiers of Berengar's ranks slowly began to trot off at the enemy position while his infantry prepared their muskets. The levies at the moment were used to protect the flanks of Berenger's line infantry. With this formation, rapidly assembled Berengar's forces began to march slowly and uniformly towards the enemy army, the cavalry already beginning their charge. As the cavalry charged towards the enemy, the thunder of the 12-pound cannons resounded in the distance as explosive shells were launched upon the enemy forces. The explosive blast and the shrapnel from the shells battered the enemy forces, quickly turning the lightly armored levies into chunks of flesh and meat paste. Limbs were scattered, heads rolled, and blood stained the snow below. However, there was only one battery able to fire upon the enemy. As such, the numbers of the enemy forces who were affected by the barrage were significantly less than in Berenger's previous battles. Berenger was naturally at the head of the cavalry and quickly pulled both of his pistols from Erwin's saddle. It was already loaded and prepared to fire. All that needed to be done was cocking the flintlock action, which Berenger and his cuirassiers did in unison. The enemy had a few archers with them and began to fire on the steel-clad horses of Berenger's cuirassiers. At this period in history, barding was still an effective way to protect your horse, and as such, Berenger had spent a great sum of money armoring the horses of his cavalry. After all, they cost him a fortune to purchase. It would be a shame if they died so easily on the battlefield. The arrows loosed upon his cavalry as a large volley fell from the sky as if they were raindrops, yet to the dismay of the enemy's forces, the arrows failed to gravely injure neither the horses nor the cuirassiers. Instead, the three-quarters plate armor and the steel plate barding covered the majority of the cavalry's body, deflected the bolts as if a padded arrow was hitting them. If anything, a few arrows found their way into the gaps in the armor, but these were not vital areas, and as such did little more than inflict pain upon the riders and their horses. As such, the enemy levies quickly raised their spears, anticipating a clash from the heavily armored cavalry forces. However, before such a situation could occur, the horses strafed out of the direction of the spear walls and galloped to the side. While the horses maneuvered in this way, the hundreds of cuirassiers pulled on the triggers of their two pistols and aimed down the enemy at point-blank range. As the hundreds of pistols went off, they quickly cut through what meager defenses the levies were equipped with and shredded the bodies of the men who made contact with the lead balls. Blood-curdling screams filled the air as the blood of the levies splashed upon their comrades. After firing their shots, the cuirassiers quickly stowed away their pistols and unsheathed their heavy cavalry swords as they rerouted their horses into a full-scale charge. By now, the enemy ranks, which was comprised of mostly greenhorn levies, were filled with terror and dread as they were pushed forward by the somewhat more veteran forces behind them into the meat grinder. They could not help but think to themselves that the weapons in which Berenger and his army wielded were some form of vile sorcery gained by consorting with the devil's minions. These were an uneducated and superstitious bunch, and the propaganda the church put out about Berenger filled their fearful minds as they walked ever closer to the enemy formations. When the musketeers finally got within firing range, they formed a proper firing squad with the first column kneeling and the second holding their rifles above the heads of their kneeling comrades. The officers gave the orders to fire, which resulted in over 1,000 lead projectiles flying down range and into the bodies of the levies advancing upon them. With a single volley, the hostile peasant levies were quickly overwhelmed by Berenger's technological superiority, many of which had begun to break ranks and flee back to the city. As for the brave souls who remained and continued to fight Berenger's forces, they were quickly cut down by another volley of fire before even reaching their enemies. Unlike previous battles, Berenger did not immediately give chase. Instead, he raised his fists and gave the opposite order. Halt! With that, his forces came to a sudden stop. The levies of Berenger's forces were thanking God that their lords were wise enough to join forces with Berenger, for if it were them who had marched upon such an army, they too would be lying dead in the snow. After gazing upon the violent remains of the battlefield, Berenger noticed a sea of corpses whose blood had drained out onto the snow below. The grim sight had left those uninitiated among Berenger's ranks feeling sick to their stomachs. After standing in the cold gazing upon the grisly scene, one of the lords who had backed Berenger finally snapped out of his daze. The scenes of the battle that had just been waged consumed his sense of reason for quite some time. Now that his mind had returned to him, he asked Berenger about the routing enemies. "Should we not pursue them?" Berenger merely shook his head and pointed his blood-stained sword at the piles of hundreds of corpses that lay scattered across the frost-covered ground before speaking the thoughts on his mind. A wicked grin was on his face as he revealed the details of his plan. "They have already paid a great price for rebelling against us. When the survivors return to the city and inform the garrison of what they have witnessed here today, how do you think that will affect the morale of the defenders? When we finally lay siege to the city and unleash the power of our guns upon it, do you think they will still have the will to fight?" With that said, the lords who had backed Berenger instantly thought what would have happened to them if they had chosen to stand with Lothar against Berenger, and they shivered at the chilling thought. Surely their cities would be next. Luckily for them, they had chosen to back the right horse. Without allowing the lords time to respond to his remarks, Berenger raised his sword in the air and commanded the army behind him. "I want a siege camp built before sundown. Forward march!" With that, the army that had suffered few casualties in this battle began to march upon the city of Sterzing, where they would lay siege to it for the next few days. Though Berenger had no way of knowing how his other two armies were faring, he had a feeling that they were in a similar position to him right now. As such, he smiled as he rode on horseback into the vicinity of the city of Sterzing. Berenger sat atop his trusty steed Erwin. The muscular black destrier gallantly trotted at the front of the army in which Berenger was currently leading. Aside from the thousands of infantry he had at his back, the man also led a few thousand levies raised from the lords and regents of the portion of southern Tyrol in which supported Berenger and his campaign. Beside him were the commanders of these mostly levy-based units. They were clad in knightly armor in the design fitting for the time period. This army was one of three which had begun to march on three critical regions, which acted as the centers of rebellion against Duke Wilmar within the region of Tyrol. By laying siege to these areas, Berenger would effectively bring southern Tyrol under his control in one fell swoop. As such, Berenger smiled as the men in his army sang along to the marching song Erica from his previous life. It had become one of the favorites of the men in his army. The levies and noblemen who were marching aside Berenger and his army were quite confused about the chipper nature of Berenger's soldiers. The veterans of Berenger's army knew that thus far casualties had been low among their forces, and now they had a bunch of levies to soak up the enemy's arrows and bolts. Thus they were in a perfect mood. As for the conscripts who recently joined the army, they were following their senior's lead. Before long, Berenger's forces had arrived at the city of Sterzing and once more made camp outside of the enemy's range of fire but well within their own. Though he only had 3 cannons in this army, as he had split up the battalion among the 3 armies, if concentrated on one wall, it would be more than enough to open a gap for his forces to charge through. The cannoneers, who at this point were well accustomed to laying siege, had quickly set up the guns behind some defensive barriers and began to fire off at the city's walls. When the thunder of the guns echoed into the evening sky, the many levies became frightened, not knowing how to react to such a thing. Seeing the distraught expressions on the faces of the levies, the veterans and conscripts of Berenger's army all began to laugh at the men and the pathetic looks on their faces. If these levies looked like they were about to shit bricks, they could only imagine the faces of the enemies currently bombarded with explosive shells. Berenger decided to take a moment to comment on the situation. Is there anything more beautiful than the echo of an artillery battery and the smell of gunpowder amid a cold winter's sunset? He was speaking to his officers and the lords who had gathered to support him. If Eckhard were here at the moment, he would probably sigh and think to himself that Berenger was enjoying himself a little too much in this campaign of his. As for the other officers under Berenger's command, they all gazed off into the sunset much like Berenger had and took a moment to listen to the thunder of guns and the screams of the bombarded among the beautiful scenery. One of his officers spoke up to Berenger and his twisted idea of beauty. "My lord, I think you should lie down, you are clearly unwell." Berenger merely chuckled at the man's comments and smiled as he inhaled deeply, enjoying the scene before his eyes. After snapping back to reality after several moments, Berenger gave the officers their orders. "Well, what are you all standing around and waiting for? Make sure the camp is properly established, and the sentries are set to schedule. We don't want a repeat of what happened in Schwaz, do we? Fearing the backlash of their lord and commander, the officers quickly got to task assembling the siege camp. Under the sunset, thousands of black and gold tents were quickly set up, with a series of trenches supported by sandbags and barbed wire established around the perimeter. Guard towers were on all sides to keep a watchful eye on the potential arrival of enemies. Berenger had failed to use a trench system outside of Schwaz, which was a mistake on his part. By digging a semi-modern trench system around the encampment, he was capable of providing a vastly superior line of defense against oncoming attackers, which could fully make use of the several hundred rifled muskets in his army and their range advantage. As the sun faded away and the moon replaced it in the sky above, Berenger decided to take the first watch. Thus he grabbed a hold of a musket, loaded it, and climbed into the trench system where several sentries were keeping watch. Seeing their lord and commander jump in the hole with them, these new conscripts were quite shocked. They expected Berenger to be in some large tent, with a fire going and maybe even a woman by his side. Yet here he was, taking up the first watch in the trenches alongside them. Berenger gazed into the distance as he looked upon the city's walls, which were under a near-constant bombardment. It would take a few days for the walls to come down, and when they did, resistance in the south would come to a swift end as long as the other sieges were also successful. Though with his tactics, and the enemy's lack of understanding towards them, he did not fear defeat in this war. It would be quite some time before the other European powers would begin fielding firearms en masse. However, his victory in this war would certainly spark the development of such sophisticated weapons. Due to Berenger's influence on this timeline's events, the matchlock would come into existence far earlier than it had in his past life. When it did, Berenger would finally be facing some stiffer resistance from his opponents, but for now, the advantages that firearms presented were too great for his enemies to overcome. Military historians would study Berenger's campaign in Tyrol for generations to come. This war in which Berenger fought would symbolize the end of an era, as soon the entire world realized that the age of knights and chivalry had long passed. The era of steel and shot had just begun. Berenger spent the first shift of the night on watch, protecting the barriers of the camp as a sentry within the trenches. The use of a trench line supported by sandbags and barbed wire was an invention that would normally not exist until the late century. However, with his past life's memory as a combat engineer, Berenger developed such a defensive system with ease. Barbed wire had been used extensively in his fields to keep cattle and other domesticated livestock within the boundaries of the grazing land allotted to them. However, after the ambush on his previous encampment in Schwaz, Berenger quickly learned to utilize trench tactics. When he was resupplying in Innsbruck, he ordered a barbed wire shipment to his army. The sappers in his army spent some time constructing such complex fortifications. Still, in the end, the encampment was so well defended that the likelihood they would suffer significant casualties from an enemy ambush was extremely low. Luckily for them, after seeing the odd defenses of the camp, the enemy did not bother to send a force to test it. It was already terrifying enough to suffer the explosive bombardment of the 12-pound cannons. After staying on the watch for the first shift, Berenger returned to his tent and slept until the dawn, where he was among the first of his troops to awaken in the morning. Though he did not have access to coffee at the moment, he fully intended to establish a trade with the Byzantine Empire in exchange for coffee when his territory grew to a significant enough degree that he could trade with Empire to the east with ease. As for now, Berenger and his troops primarily relied on their own natural ability to awaken and stay awake. When the morning came, the armies gathered in the trenches, and those with the 141718 rifled muskets fired off shots at the defenders on the wall with a fair degree of competency. Though not every shot claimed the defenders' lives, enough of them hit their mark to permanently scare the garrison of Sterzing to keep their heads down. While his troops utilized their advanced weapons to intimidate the enemy forces, Berenger was in discussion with his officers over his plans for the ongoing war effort. Like normal, Berenger drank from a pitcher of light beer as he continued his discussion about the operation to his officers and the lords in command of the many units of levies that comprised their ranks. It will take another day or two before the wall comes down. As such, we will continue to bombard it regularly. When the wall finally crumbles, we will send the levies into the fray while the line infantry will be kept behind and fire upon the defenders on the wall. The cavalry will stay and protect the encampment until a time arises where the enemy has been pushed back. Though the lords who had shown their support to Berenger were perturbed by the fact that their levies would be used to storm the gap, they could not very well decline. As for Berenger's officers, they were more concerned about the success of Operation Trident as a whole, and as such, one of them voiced their concerns. "What about Eckhard and Arnulf's armies? How are they faring?" Berenger slid the wooden pieces which represented the Allied forces into position outside of the city walls of Schlanders and Meran and addressed the officer's question. "I have recently received notice that Arnulf and Eckhard's armies have begun to lay siege to the rebellious cities. Within a week, the majority of the resistance in the south will come to an end, and we will be able to march on the Prince Bishopric of Trent, thus ending the rebellion within Tyrol once and for all. The push into Trent would require the unification of his three armies." With his ambitions to conquer the region, Berenger was taking advantage of the rebellion in Tyrol to seize the land in its entirety, even what would be considered Italian regions in the century. Trent was not technically part of the county of Tyrol. They were, in fact, an independent prince-bishopric and recognized as church territory. Due to the conflicts between Berenger and the Crutch, Berenger had fully intended to conquer the region and incorporate it into his territory. Especially since the Bishop of Trent had openly declared his support for the Tyrolean rebels, simply out of spite for Berenger. By doing so, the Church had given Berenger an excuse to invade the Prince-Bishopric of Trent and thus unite the entirety of Tyrol under his authority. Since Berenger was given this opportunity, he did not intend to waste it. His plans to march on Trent did not sit well with the other lords, who considered it an unlawful annexation of ecclesiastical territory. One of the lords even spoke his mind on the matter, which visibly upset Berenger. "You intend to march on an ecclesiastical principality? Under what grounds do you dare to usurp the territory of the Church?" Berenger stared coldly at the old and pious nobleman who had sided with Berenger out of support of Duke Wilmar, despite his religious objections to the heretic known by the Church as Berenger the Accursed. The look in Berenger's eyes displayed his murderous intent. Rather than justify his actions through the legal jargon, Berenger took a more daring approach. "The Church has already declared war upon me. Therefore Trent will be mine by right of conquest. Since I have the might to seize their territory, I will do so, and if the Bishop of Trent has any complaints, he can say it directly to my face before I have him placed in front of a firing squad." The fact that the Church had sent the Teutonic Order on a mission to invade Berenger's lands and usurp his authority was already considered a declaration of war by the young Viscount's standards. As such, he did not fear invading their nearby lands and capturing them for himself. As for the allied lords, they could tell by the look in Berenger's eyes that he was entirely serious about conquering Trent and that he would not be persuaded otherwise. Though they disagreed with his actions, they were far too frightened by the weapons his army possessed. Thus they were intimidated into backing down and following orders, though they secretly prayed that they would not be excommunicated for following Berenger's orders. After concluding his thoughts and informing his officers of how to proceed, Berenger dismissed the men and allowed them to spend their free time as they wished. There was not much to do outside of maintaining order and waiting for the wall to crumble down. Thus Berenger used this time to write to Linda and Adela, informing him of his progress and that his war would swiftly come to an end. As the cannons roared and the muskets echoed throughout the day, Berenger found himself in a tranquil mood. Soon enough, the walls would come crumbling down, and his forces would invade the city. By then, the defenders would either surrender the castle to him in fear of retribution, or a massacre would unfold. Either way, Berenger would be happy with the results. As for Eckhard and Arnulf, their armies were similar in laying siege to the enemy while staying in their camps. While the war in Tyrol progressed rapidly, the remainder of the conflicts in the German regions were bogged down in long sieges and bloody field battles. Only Berenger and his use of superior technology and tactics could so quickly win a war. As for the rest of Germany, Berenger reckoned it would be years before the conflict was over, and he fully intended to spend a fair portion of his time securing his power and advancing his new territory once he officially conquered Tyrol and established himself as a legitimate count. While Berenger and his armies were at war in southern Tyrol, Count Lothar was surrounded by his enemies. At the moment, Lothar and his armies were sandwiched in between Count Otto's forces, who besieged the city, and the castle's garrison, who valiantly continued to defend the castle's walls against Lothar's onslaught. Worse yet, right before he was trapped within the confines of the city, he was informed that his army that was sent to Kufstein had been completely obliterated. Though, he did not know the extent to which Berenger had put down his rebellion within his home territory, for if he did, the man would truly lose all hope of survival. As such, Count Lothar was currently surrounded by his vassals who had traveled with him to Vienna, where they were engaged in a discussion about how to move forward. They were not in a good position. Count Otto's armies, though depleted by attrition, still greatly outnumbered his own forces now that they had lost a quarter of their army in Kufstein and had been fighting a siege for over a month. As the noblemen spoke about their situation, blood-curdling screams erupted from the walls, as the defenders continued to die by the dozens defending their position within the city, thus adding a great degree of intimidation to the hearts of the noblemen who had followed their liege seemingly into the gates of hell itself. One such nobleman was addressing the gathering of lords as he voiced his opinions about their options. It has become increasingly clear that there are only two options: stay within the city and continue to lay siege to the castle while simultaneously protecting the city walls. If we can succeed, we can use the Duke's family as hostages to negotiate Otto's surrender. The only other option is to sally forth in a desperate attempt to break through the besieging forces and make our way back to Tyrol, where we can hold our ground against the Duke's forces when he returns from his conquest of Bavaria. After saying this, the gathering erupted into chaos as two factions were formed: those who supported staying in Vienna and fighting for what they had worked so hard to achieve, and those who wanted to return to Tyrol and resist Wilmar's rule as they conserved their strength. Of course, those who wanted to return to Tyrol had no way of knowing that by the time they arrived, it would be in Berenger's hands, and key cities would be staffed with large garrisons of men, with their walls armed with cannons. Count Lothar was entirely unwilling to give up on Vienna. He knew in his heart that if they fought their way out of this mess and returned to Innsbruck to lick their wounds, they will have lost the war. They might be able to survive for a few years in a desperate struggle against the Duke's forces, but in the end, they would be brought to ruin. Their families would pay the price for their defiance. Eventually, the Count raised his hand to silence his lords, and only after their arguments had completely ceased did he voice his decision. I will not concede defeat. I will not retire to Tyrol and live out the rest of my days fighting a defensive war against the Duke and his armies. We will take Vienna, or we will die trying. If we abandon our siege, only death and destruction await our households. Tell the men at the city wall to defend it with their lives. As for the siege of the castle, double our efforts. We must not fail. When Lothar announced his decision, a variety of expressions appeared on the faces of the vassals loyal to him. Some of them were beginning to regret their decision to back his efforts to claim the Duchy of Austria for himself. Many of them wondered how Berenger was faring in his reconquest of Tyrol. If he had managed to take Innsbruck during this time, then there was no point to continue this war any further. As ultimately every lord who was present for the siege agreed with Lothar, they would remain trapped in the city until a point where the enemy forces were exhausted, or until they had taken the castle, where they would then use the Duke's family as hostages to enforce their demands. It was a risky option, but Lothar was right. If they returned to Tyrol and ended their campaign, ultimately, only death would await them and their families. As such, the siege of Vienna continued, with Lothar's armies trapped between enemy forces, fighting a two-front battle. With the arrival of Otto's forces, the castle's defenders became emboldened, and their collapsing morale had been restored to its peak. If they could hold out just a little longer, Lothar's army would collapse, and they would be saved. For now, it was a battle of will to see whose lines would break first. As such, Gottbert, the son and heir of Duke Wilmar, gazed from the ramparts above down onto the city below with a smile on his face. Soon enough, this battle would come to an end, and at the moment, it was heavily in his favor. The young regent wished he could see the look on Lothar's face when he realized he was trapped within the city, with no way out. As just now, he noticed the increase in the intensity of the siege of his family's castle and therefore began sliding his visor down to protect his face from the oncoming missile fire. The young man shook his head as he voiced his thoughts aloud. It appears that Count Lothar has realized he is running out of time. As such, Gottbert unsheathed his sword and raised it in the air as he shouted to the defenders with a heroic speech of defense. Men, you have all worked hard this past month to ensure the castle of your liege, the rightful Duke of Austria, and his family remain unharmed. Over the course of the next few days, Lothar will throw everything he has at us, but we cannot allow this castle to fall. For if the castle falls, the suffering of the citizens of this city will be in vain. Hold the line. Hold the line as if your very soul depended upon it. With these words spoken, the defenders rallied behind the commander of their forces. They screamed into the air, allowing all of the anxiety and misery they had endured over the last month to escape from the confines of their hearts. With this speech, a new sense of zealotry was formed among the defenders, which would hopefully allow them to endure through the hardship that would follow and successfully defend their position until Count Lothar's forces were broken by Otto's. With these events, the siege of Vienna had reached its climax and would soon be coming to an end. Who won the battle was solely determined by the castle's garrison and their will to continue defending its mighty stone walls. While Berenger was engaging in Operation Trident, and Otto was laying siege to Vienna to liberate its population from Lothar's tyranny, Linda was resting in Kufstein presiding over Berenger's reforms. Through the conquest of Schwaz and Innsbruck, she had begun incorporating it into Kufstein's jurisdiction, and though she did not allow for conscription of the people in the region yet, infrastructure projects and agricultural overhauls were underway. The sooner she got them under construction, the sooner the profits would show themselves. The people of Kufstein enjoyed their lives during this time of chaos as they were well insulated from the violence and the bloodshed that was appearing across the German world at this time. However, many young men decided to fulfill their patriotic duty and volunteered for military service. Of course, the volunteers were only a small percentage of the troops being raised to not only aid in Berenger's campaign but ensure the defense and stability of the entirety of Tyrol, which Berenger would soon conquer. As such, thousands of young men were currently undergoing basic training, where they would then enter specialized training in the field they were most suited for. After receiving the first batch of conscripts in Innsbruck, Berenger instructed Linda to continue specialized training, with infantry being the main focus, followed by artillery, and then the cavalry. Berenger currently had an entire cavalry battalion under his command, and because the unit had suffered limited casualties during the war, it was more than enough to deter the cavalry forces of any potential army that he would come across for the time being. At the moment, the newest batch of recruits had begun their basic training and were going through basic PT to get them into fighting shape quickly. Push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, runs, etc. became a daily exercise for the men who had been forced into service. Basic marches and formations were also drilled into their heads. They also practiced how to operate their weapons efficiently, as a set of drills were created to quickly instill the loading procedure of the muskets into the muscle memory of the men who wielded them. As such, the military bases used to house and train recruits were overflowing with thousands of young men who had just entered the armed forces. Some of them had been here for weeks and would soon ship out to their stations across Tyrol, whether that was in the form of a field army or acting as a garrison. As for the officers, the surviving knights and noblemen of the captured regions were incorporated into Berenger's army and were effectively trained to fulfill the position of his officer class. Seeing as how they went from being lords and knights to officers, there was an initial degree of defiance by the cadets. Still, when they came to realize how effectively organized Berenger's semi-modern army was, they quickly changed their tune. There was a degree of civility and respect afforded to officers much like that of a knight or nobleman, and as such, they quickly found themselves at home within the officer class. Granted, it was a meritocratic force, and they would not be afforded the position due to their birth. They would still have to graduate from the so-called military academy and climb through the ranks through a display of competency. Yet, at the moment, there were few if any commoners among the officer class, so for the time being it had essentially been turned into a position held by the nobility within Berenger's military hierarchy. After all, few commoners were educated enough to lead soldiers into battle properly. While the conscripts continued their training, Linda was reading the news she had received from Adela about their father's battle in Vienna. The likelihood of her father surviving the siege was slim, but there was a chance the weasel could escape and return to Innsbruck. While she was reading the letter in Berenger's office, the door opened to reveal her brother Lietbert, who she had not seen since the awkward family reunion they had a few days prior. After appearing in her office, Lietbert noticed the look on his little sister's face and began to question what she was reading. "Is the letter important?" After realizing that she had been smiling wickedly, Linda placed down the letter for Lietbert to read. "Father is trapped in Vienna, and Berenger has begun to lay siege to the key centers of resistance within southern Tyrol. It is only a matter of time before Father loses the war. I suggest you find out where your loyalties lie before it is over. After all, Berenger is ruthless when it comes to dealing with his enemies." Seeing the letters Linda had provided Lietbert, which contained great intelligence about the ongoing war efforts, Lietbert could not comprehend why Linda would allow him to see such valuable information and voiced his concerns aloud.
Why did you allow me to read this?
Linda merely laughed lightly at his question and rested her beautiful face onto the palm of her hand while stared at Lietbert with a gaze filled with familial affection.
Because you are my brother Lietbert, and I do not want to see you end up like father. So I am giving you the option to make an informed choice.
Either bend the knee to Berenger and recognize him as the Count of Tyrol by right of conquest. Or support father, and side with his failing rebellion, though if you publicly voice your support for father, when he finally loses, you will be sure to suffer as a traitor. Thus an important decision was thrust upon Lietbert. He could either show his loyalty to his father, condemn Berenger as a heretic and traitor, and reject his claims to the county of Tyrol, which by the looks of it will not end well for him. Or he could submit to Berenger's authority and throw away his family's position as counts. Before he made his choice, Lietbert had one final question to ask Linda about her lover's plans for the future. If I do as you ask, what becomes the position of our family? Linda stretched her back into the soft leather chair and grinned with a comfortable smile as she informed Lietbert of Berenger's decision. We will obviously lose status as counts for a while, but Berenger's ambitions don't lie at simply being a count, nor does he wish to be a duke as our father desires. When Berenger finally unites the German-speaking regions into a single cohesive empire, he will need talented and loyal men to fill the positions in his government. At the moment, his political reforms are in a stage of infancy, but I will let you in on a little secret. It will not matter which noble title you have in the coming years, at least not as much as it does now. By gaining the favor of the future emperor and proving yourself as a competent and loyal subject, that is how you will gain political and economic power in the future. When Lietbert heard the height of Berenger's ambitions from his sister's mouth, he could hardly believe it. Still, he could hardly consider himself a skeptic when thinking about how quickly Tyrol has fallen into Berenger's hands. If the man could seize Tyrol with an army in the thousands, what could he do with an army in the tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands? So long as Berenger managed to keep himself alive and in power, he could accomplish his vision. Thinking about the position he stood and that of his family, excluding their rebellious father, Lietbert sighed heavily and nodded his head as he decided the important crossroads he had found himself in.
All right, I will support Berenger in any way you need me to.
From the intelligence you have shown to me, father is doomed to fail in his war, and Tyrol will soon fall into Berenger's hands. It will be doubtful for the Duke to trust the governance of Tyrol to our family after father's actions, so I hereby submit to Berenger's authority. Linda smiled devilishly as she heard her brother relent, and she rose from her seat to pat the young man on his back. You have chosen well, brother. With this, Berenger's ascension to Count of Tyrol could no longer be argued if the heir to Lothar was willing to relinquish his claim in favor of Berenger. Unknowingly, Berenger had gained a valuable ally in his future wars. After all, Lietbert was a wise and intelligent young man. One who would prove instrumental to Berenger's future gains. It was late into the fourth morning of the siege of Sterzing when the wall finally came crumbling down to the ground, yet unlike previous sieges where the musketeers would rush into the fray and open fire on the enemy before running them down with their bayonets in a great melee, the rifled musketeers fired their shots from the safety of the trenches, continuing to engage the defending archers who stood on the ramparts. As for the force that rushed the now giant gap in the wall, it was the levies. Poorly trained and equipped but fearful of the musketeers behind their ranks, the levies boldly charged the enemy garrison under the protective fire of the rifled musketeers from afar.
As for the many more smoothbore musketeers, they continued to hold their position until it was time for them to advance.
Bodies fell from the ramparts as the archers revealed themselves to fire upon those who penetrated the now giant hole within the wall. Spears were thrust into the torsos of the levies from both sides. It was a levy versus levy fight at the moment, as very few men-at-arms were left behind in Tyrol. Blood spilled across the floor, and bodies soon filled up the gap. Without using firearms to break the line of defense, it quickly turned into a stalemate as the enemy defenders plugged the hole, funneling the levies in a few at a time. When Berenger saw the stalemate begin to transpire, he raised a small flag and waved it, signaling the levies to pull back and the smoothbore musketeers to advance. The rifled musketeers fired from their defensive positions while the cannons bombarded the ramparts, allowing the smoothbore musketeers to advance with sufficient covering fire. Eventually, the allied levies that supported Berenger's forces had withdrawn, allowing the musketeers to form a firing squad in the gap and rain a volley down upon the forces defending the hole. After the volley gunned down the front row of defenders, the grenadiers advanced and lobbed their grenades into the gap between the walls. The explosion of several dozen grenades filled the gap where the explosive blast and the shrapnel tore the defenders to pieces. Afterward, the grenadiers and line infantry pulled back, allowing the levies to once more charge the now concussed and injured defenders. This time Berenger sat back in the camp and enjoyed the show while the battle continued to wage on. Berenger spoke to the lords next to him who had brought the levies. "Your levies have provided more support than you realize. They are dealing quite a degree of damage to the enemy forces." The lords merely scoffed at Berenger's remark. He was obviously using the levies to wear the enemy down and save the lives of his own men. Of course, any general worth their salt would use such a tactic. After all, it cost a great sum to arm, train, and supply Berenger's forces. He would preserve their lives as best as possible, and until now, Berenger still considered the levies as allied forces, not belonging to his own authority as such. He did not care for their lives like he did that of his own men. The course of the battle continued in such a manner for quite some time. Every time the battle reached a stalemate, the grenadiers and line infantry would break it, allowing the allied levies to continue their advance. Unlike previous sieges where he had 3 entrances to divert the enemy's attention to, allowing him to advance into the city rapidly, he now had to fight several thousand defenders in one single gap. As such, the battle waged well into the night before Berenger pulled back his forces to the siege camp. Under the continuous bombardment of Berenger's artillery, the battle for the city had reached a stalemate. In total, over 1,000 men had perished this day, but for Berenger, even his allied levies suffered significantly fewer casualties than the enemy. After all, they were protected by covering fire and gained significant ground against the enemy forces who filled the gap between the walls. Berenger's goal was to repeat this tactic the following day if the city's defenders still had the will to fight, that was. Berenger, of course, was suspecting the city's garrison to surrender. The levies who were raised to fight against Berenger had suffered significant casualties both in the field battle before and throughout the duration of the siege. Unless they all wished to die fighting, there would be some form of defection that would transpire this night. As Berenger had guessed, several hundred defenders opened the gates to the city and raised the white flag after a couple of hours. Under cover of darkness, Berenger's troops were ordered to march into the city and restrain the defenders. Though this action had been done without the knowledge of the local lord, ultimately, the defenders felt the price to pay to secure their lord's power was too great. Thus Berenger was welcomed in by the defenders, who threw their weapons away and saluted him and his army with respect reserved for conquering heroes. While the lord slept in ignorance throughout the night in his castle, the city was swiftly secured by Berenger and his army. As the surrendered levies were treated as prisoners of war and were afforded proper lodgings and humane treatment by Berenger's army, which thoroughly surprised the lords beneath his command. One of them decided to inquire about Berenger's behavior as they rode upon their horses' backs throughout the city, which was being secured by their troops. Asked, "Why are you treating the defenders with such dignity?" Berenger looked ahead into the darkness of the city and saw that the enemy forces were being tied up and led to containment. Now that they had surrendered, he would make sure no harm befell them. With a smile on his face, he replied to the lord's inquiry. "They have surrendered and voluntarily disarmed themselves. They pose no threat and clearly no hostile intentions. As long as they do not pose a danger to myself or my troops, I will treat them with the dignity that soldiers should be afforded. After all, their bravery in the face of overwhelming odds should be commended, for they lasted far longer against my forces than I had initially estimated. Only a savage would cut down a defenseless man." Berenger may be willing to give no quarter to enemies who had begun to flee in the face of his overwhelming might. Still, to a force who had properly surrendered and thrown themselves at his mercy, only their leaders would pay the price for rising against him. The average soldier who was following orders could not be blamed for the actions of his superiors. This was how a civilized man conducted himself in the art of war. After saying his piece, the lords who allied themselves with Berenger began to see him in a new light. He was not as ruthless of a conqueror as they had initially thought. Instead, he had some insights into warfare that could change the way in which such a thing was conducted within the civilized world. To the feudal lords of a barbaric era, this idea of treating the disarmed combatants of the enemy with dignity was a new and bold concept, one which Berenger and his forces would become renowned for as he waged his many wars of conquest. Eckhard stood in the middle of the siege camp in which he had prepared outside the city of Meran. He was currently wearing his blackened munitions half-plate armor with brass trim over his winter clothing. A German-style burgonet was adorned atop his head, protecting his skull from potential harm. The 3 ridges that formed at the top of the helmet were trimmed with brass, as were the edges of the helmet. The veteran knight, who now acted as Berenger's field marshal, scowled as he watched the ongoing siege of Meran. Due to an increase in distance when compared to Sterzing, it took him an extra day to arrive at his target with his army. Unlike Berenger, he did not engage in a field battle before setting up the siege, as such his army was well rested for the campaign to take the south. While Berenger had developed a taste for the gruesome nature of warfare, Eckhard was quite honestly tired of it. He had seen too much death in his life, and the fertile fields of 100 battlefields being turned into a barren wasteland scorched by the fires of war, and the blood of battle were etched into his permanent memory. However, as a knight whose only skills were in the art of war, he had no other option in life but to fight until the day of his death. Hearing the blood-curdling screams of the enemy defenders who were gunned down by the rifled musketeers in his army, many of which had become talented marksmen by this point in the campaign, he could not help but sigh and shake his head as he mumbled his inner thoughts under his breath. So much unnecessary death. They should just surrender, their defeat is inevitable. Despite the grizzled veterans' views of the conflict, the enemy persisted with all of their being in defending against the technologically advanced forces of Eckhard's army. Much like Berenger, the army in which he had been tasked with commanding was filled with a mix of veterans, conscripts, and levies. Many of the surviving veterans in this conflict would go on to become NCOs, and even officers within Berenger's future imperial army, but for now they merely hunkered down in the trenches and fired upon the enemy from a distance which was out of reach from the longbows and crossbows of the feudal garrison in which they were facing off against. It was after making this observation that the wall finally came crumbling down. After a few days of laying siege to Meran, victory was within his grasp. Eckhard began to wonder if Berenger and Arnulf had already conquered their cities. Nevertheless, now was not the time for that. As such, Eckhard grabbed a hold of his loaded musket and ordered his troops to prepare to storm the gap. Eckhard took a different approach to the battle than Berenger did. He bombarded the gaps within the wall with explosive shells, making sure to deal massive damage to whatever men were foolish enough to stay near the gap. After bombarding the location for some time, the enemy was afraid to protect it. As such, they had managed to stay quite a distance away from the area. When Eckhard finally called for the bombardment to stop, the gap was rushed by the nearby musketeers and levies who ran into the city and began their slaughter. No matter how mighty of defense was initially planned, under the fire of muskets, whose flanks were covered by the levies, the city quickly fell into the hands of Eckhard. As one of Berenger's generals, Eckhard had made sure to enforce Berenger's rules about the treatment of civilians and POWs. Any man who willingly surrendered to Eckhard and his army was treated with a degree of dignity, and under the watchful gaze of Eckhard's forces who had Berenger's rules of war drilled into their heads, the levies were prevented from acting out and causing a scene. After all of the enemies were rounded up as prisoners of war, and the civilians were accounted for, Eckhard gave the order to begin the bombardment of the castle. Unfortunately for Eckhard, the enemy regent was stubborn and refused to surrender. As such, the bombardment continued for several days more before the walls came crumbling down. Wanting to end the battle as quickly as possible, Eckhard ordered his grenadiers into position to open fire on the enemy forces before lobbing their grenades into the gap. A common tactic utilized by grenadiers. After causing significant death and destruction to the enemy defense, a great melee had broken out as levies, conscripts and veterans clashed with the enemy garrison. The castle was protected by the elites left behind in Meran and comprised of heavily armored troops resembling men-at-arms. Eckhard stayed in the back of the army and watched as his forces slowly captured the courtyard before bashing down the castle's doors with a battering ram, where they marched inside with their muskets loaded, bayonets affixed, and spears in hand. What followed was a slaughter of every man who resisted until finally, they entered the grand hall where the regent was standing firmly in defiance of Eckhard's army. When Eckhard forced his way to the front and saw the proud regent, he could not help but sigh in his heart. This man was clearly willing to die rather than admit defeat. The regent, noticing the respect given to Eckhard, realized the possibility that he was the commander of this army. As such, he asked in confusion as to the location of Berenger. "You are much too old to be Berenger the Accursed. Who are you? And where is the heretic who lays siege to my lands?" Eckhard noticed the usage of the phrase "my lands" despite being a mere regent, which suggested the man undoubtedly had an overinflated sense of pride. As such, he sighed and introduced his rank and name to the regent, who acted in power as the lord of this region was off in Vienna fighting Lothar's war. "I am Field Marshal Eckhard von Hallstatt, Berenger's leading general. he has tasked me with laying siege to this city, and as such, I have full authority to accept your surrender. With the massive growth of Berenger's armies, he had begun to implement a proper rank system in his army, which was equivalent to a modern military's. Unlike America in Berenger's past life, he used the rank field marshal to give to Eckhard as the highest-ranking general of all of his armies. The stubborn lord looked at Eckhard as if he was joking, and once more inquired about Berenger's whereabouts. Where exactly is Berenger if he is not laying siege to my grand city? Eckhard once more noticed the usage of the term mine when referring to the city, and if it was not obvious before, it became apparent now to everyone in the room that this regent was not only stubborn but incredibly arrogant, thinking that the leader of the loyalist forces in Tyrol would come to Meran himself. As such, Eckhard grinned and informed the man of his true value. Berenger is currently laying siege to Sterzing and has asked me to take Meran in his absence. Now that the city belongs to us, and the castle has been secured, I highly suggest you surrender, if not I will imprison you by force. At this point it did not matter if the regent surrendered or not, the city was Eckhard's and by extension Berenger's. The regent's willingness to accept defeat was irrelevant. Yet shockingly, without an army to protect him, or the will of the people to stand up for him, the regent still refused to admit that he had lost, and instead chastised Eckhard. I will never surrender this city so long as I draw breath. When Lothar and my liege return, they will drive you into the depths of hell, and I will be greatly rewarded for my loyalty. Seeing the stubbornness of this regent had turned into stupidity at this point, Eckhard merely sighed and gave his troops an order. Arrest this man, and put him in solitary confinement. I do not want him influencing the prisoners to rebel against our rule here. With that said, the soldiers pounded their chests in a salute and obeyed his commands. Yes, sir. After saying that, they quickly locked up the man in chains, despite his best attempts to struggle, and dragged him off to the dungeon kicking and screaming. I cannot wait to see how Duke Lothar slaughters you traitors like pigs. You will all be damned to the afterlife for following that heretic into hell. With those words said, the troops did not react in the slightest. As far as they were concerned, Berenger was a man who had proven himself time and again worth following. No matter what the church might say, he was a righteous man, who had practically become a warrior saint in their eyes. Of course, they had no way of knowing that in the distant future after Berenger's passing there would be an enormous debate among the leaders of the Church of Germany as to whether or not Berenger should be canonized as a warrior saint. With the regent locked away, and the city's defenders defeated, the battle for Meran had resulted in a victory for Eckhard, the first of many that would come from the first field marshal of Berenger's armies. At the moment, Berenger was standing in the middle of the grand hall of Sterzing after a well-fought siege. The enemy had conceded and was kneeling before him. With the collapse in the defenses of the city the night prior, it did not take long for the cowardly regent within to surrender the castle and the city to Berenger. A few bombardments on the castle's walls, and he quickly flew the white flag, scurrying for Berenger's favor. With Sterzing and Meran won, all that remained in Operation Trident was the fall of Schlanders, and news of victory in that area would soon follow. As such, Berenger was smiling at the defeated regent, which happened to be one of the brothers of the baron who ruled over this area. Though the man was trusted with the region's defense by his elder brother, he had utterly failed in that regard. The resistance in the south had come crashing down around the might of Berenger's army, and few places still harbored ill sentiments towards Berenger's campaign, at least openly, that is. At the moment, Berenger was speaking with the regent, who was kneeling before him like a loyal subject. I will not punish you for your brother's defiance. Since you have surrendered willingly, you will be afforded the same respect I treat all of my prisoners of war. However, Sterzing is under my authority until the rule of law is restored within Tyrol. The regent was sweating buckets as he kneeled before Berenger, not willing to look into the young man's ferocious gaze. He had never seen a siege ended so quickly before, nor had he witnessed such destruction. The rapid speed in which Berenger seized control of Sterzing was unprecedented, well, unless you count his other conquests. Truly, the tactics of European warfare would change when the feudal lords of the continent eventually came to know the effectiveness of his weapons. As such, the man kept his head bent low as he thanked Berenger for his mercy. My lord, I thank you on behalf of myself and my family for sparing my life. The church had taken advantage of Berenger's conquest to spread rumors about alleged wicked acts of his army and himself. Despite conducting themselves with a degree of civility not commonly found in this medieval age, his army was branded as demon-worshipping murderers, rapists, and cannibals by the church. As such, The fear in the regent's eyes was understandable. He was clearly a fool who believed everything the church told him, and Berengar had no use for such fools in his county. That's right, his county. As far as Berengar was concerned, there was only one way for this war to end up, with him being rewarded with the title of County of Tyrol. Though at the moment he was unaware of Liutbert's decision to aid him in this regard, Berengar was still confident he would get what he wanted. Thus he looked at the regent in front of him with disgust as the man was led away to his imprisonment. Afterward, Berengar sat down on the seat of power in Sterzing and gave his orders. Prepare to rest here, and leave a garrison of 500 men. We will prepare our forces for a push into the Prince-Bishopric of Trent when we have mustered our strength. For now, enjoy yourselves, but make sure to follow the rules I have set forth. If I find anyone who dares to raid, murder, cause unnecessary harm to the civilians, and prisoners, I will have them placed before a firing squad. Do I make myself clear? With that said, the voices of the soldiers under Berengar's command who had gathered in the great hall of Sterzing voiced their support in unison. Yes, my lord. Afterward, his forces departed, and Berengar was given a reprieve from the endless violence and bloodshed that had been going on since the beginning of his war. He initially planned to march on the Prince-Bishopric of Trent in another month. This would give him time to gather troops and solidify his position, with many armed garrisons stationed throughout Tyrol enforcing his will upon the local lords. After all, for the many changes he had planned to the structure of society, the rebellion was inevitable, and he wanted his troops in place to counteract any revolution that might arise from the noblemen who were disgruntled by his changes to their feudal powers. Thus he intended to begin the constructions of small star forts in the conquered regions and house them with garrisons of local men until the day where he incorporated the entirety of Tyrol into his political, economic, industrial, and agricultural reforms. After a few days of rest, a messenger came to Berengar and handed him a series of letters, which different people wrote, but each contained important information for his war efforts. The first came from Linda, which claimed to have convinced her older brother Liutbert to support him in his bid for the title of Count of Tyrol. In fact, the man openly denounced his father and his actions during Berengar's siege of Sterzing. The next two letters were from Arnulf and Eckhard, informing Berengar that they had seized control of their targets and that Operation Trident had become an enormous success. Berengar now held the key centers of resistance to his authority in southern Tyrol. With it, the remaining rebel regions would fall into Berengar's hands in weeks. The next letter was the most important report he had received, and it was written by Adela, informing him that Lothar was surrounded in Vienna, with no way out, and the siege her father was engaging in to remove the traitor Lothar was going quite well. It would not be long until Lothar was captured by Duke Wilmar's forces and was executed. When Berengar read this news, he realized he would have to push forward his timetables. If he could not capture Trent by the time Lothar's rebellion ended, then the Duke would surely not allow him to invade Trent without a proper justification openly. At the moment, that justification was the fact that the Prince Bishop of Trent had openly declared support for Lothar's rebellion and had even supplied them. Realizing that Berengar no longer had the luxury to wait for reinforcements, he quickly wrote a pair of letters and sent them with a messenger off to Arnulf and Eckhard. The letters contained their further orders. Arnulf and Eckhard would leave garrisons behind and march on the regions that would later become known as Riva and Pergin Valsagana. As for Berengar and his forces, they would march on the city of Trent. They simply did not have the time to wait for reinforcements. After sending the letters, Berengar quickly gathered his officers, where they were confused by the unscheduled meeting but were eager to listen to Berengar's command. As such, Berengar cut to the chase and informed his troops of his monumental decision. The traitor Lothar is about to fall to Count Otto's forces. It is a matter of weeks at this point. With this said, the room resounded in applause. This meant that soon enough, the war would be over, and they could return home. However, Berengar shocked them by raising his hand and having them hold their applause. He pointed in the direction of the map in front of them, which landed directly on the Prince-Bishopric of Trent. Berengar had a fierce and determined gaze in his eyes as he gave his decree. Because of this, we will have to act quickly if we wish to end the rebellion in its entirety. As you all know, the Prince Bishop of Trent has been supplying our enemies. If we do not invade them now, we will allow the authorities in Trent to get away with the blood on their hands. As such, I hereby declare that tomorrow morning, our forces, aside from a small garrison of 250 men, designed to maintain order in the region, will march upon Trent, where we will capture the region within the next few weeks and incorporate it into the County of Tyrol. The officers were shocked at first by this news. However, when thinking of the potential rewards they could gain by seizing Trent, their eyes glistened with greed. With the new territory under his control, Berenger would need to appoint noblemen of higher regard to run it for him. Since positions in his political and military structure were based largely upon merit, the more capable one proved themselves as a leader in the upcoming conflict, the better their chances to become a baron or a viscount. Thus the passion for this invasion was far greater than that of the conquest of Tyrol, and every man desired to do their part to gain a prestigious position and untold wealth from the annexation of Trent. As for Berenger, he was excited by the fact that he could finally deal a great blow to the church, who he had already made his enemies. If they think the Teutonic Order will be enough to wipe him out in a few months, they were sadly mistaken. With his orders being given, the officers quickly relayed them to their troops, and Berenger took a sip of wine as he gazed at the map of this world. Further strengthening the resolve he had to become an unrivaled emperor, the conquest of Tyrol and Trent was only the beginning. While Berenger had begun to march his armies into the Prince-Bishopric of Trent, Duke Wilmar was engaged with the enemy Bavarians at Munich. His siege was lasting longer than he had anticipated, but it was going smooth enough. The main Bavarian armies were up in the north fighting against the regions under von Luxemburg's influence. For Eastern Germany, they were fighting among themselves for petty reasons. There was not a single region of Germany that was not embroiled in some form of warfare at the moment. Only small towns could escape the wrath of passing armies if they were lucky. Most weren't. Duke Wilmar was reading a report about Berenger's recent activities. In under 2 months, he had subjugated the northern and southern regions of Tyrol and had marched on Trent with the intent of annexing the territory through the right of conquest. Berenger's actions greatly enraged the church, who had demanded Duke Wilmar do something about his lowly vassal. The truth was, at the moment, Berenger was not directly a vassal of Duke Wilmar but Count Lothar. By supporting Duke Wilmar in his war against Lothar, Berenger was technically breaking his responsibilities as a vassal to Lothar and was actually acting in treason against his direct liege. At the moment, Duke Wilmar was very pleased with Berenger's actions. Despite being a lowly viscount, the young man had somehow gathered enough forces to rapidly retake Tyrol from the defending garrisons and the lords and regents who ruled over the area. However, what shocked him the most was that Lothar's son and heir, Liutbert, openly denounced his father and sided in support of Berenger, swearing loyalty to the man that was his family's vassal. By swearing his loyalty to Berenger, Liutbert had essentially given up on his claim for Tyrol, which put Duke Wilmar in a difficult position. The Duke of Austria grinned as he chuckled and commented to himself, "You really know how to force my hand, do you not, Berenger?" Honestly, Duke Wilmar was impressed by Berenger's capabilities and wanted the man on his side, especially with the efficiency in which he engaged in warfare. Despite the fact that he did not know Berenger's secret to swift victory, he still desired the man to be his marshal. However, since Berenger was someone else's vassal, he could not do so as such. Duke Wilmar was convinced that making Berenger Count of Tyrol was in his best interest at the moment and had thus come to a conclusion. He would even allow Berenger to keep Trent and incorporate it into his domain. Surely that would be enough to satisfy the ambitions of a man who was born a lowly baron's son. Of course, if Wilmar knew what Berenger intended to do over the upcoming years, he would have refused to give Berenger any greater authority. However, there was no magic in this world. If the gods of mankind existed, they surely did not show their presence. As such, there was no way to accurately predict the future or understand the exact thoughts in someone's head. Beside Wilmar was one of his commanders, the Count of Salzburg. His name was Wolfried von Salzburg, who was shocked by the statement the Duke had made. As such, he quickly questioned his liege on what he meant. "Apologizes for my liege, but how exactly has Berenger forced your hand?" Normally a count like Wolfried would not be familiar with some lowly viscount from another county. Still, he had heard many things about Berenger, the young man who was quite famous in Austria and several nearby German regions like Bavaria. When Wolfried received the Duke's reply, the Count could not help but look at Berenger with even higher praise. Berenger has seized nearly all of Tyrol and has currently marched on the Prince-Bishopric of Trent in an attempt to annex it from the Church. This was shocking news after all. It had been less than 2 months since Berenger first took up arms against Count Lothar, and during that entire time the Duke's army had been stuck laying siege to Munich. He began to wonder just how did the young Viscount manage to capture such a vast swath of territory so rapidly? Count Wolfried could hardly believe his ears and, as such, had to verify the information. "What did you say?" Duke Wilmar glared at Wulfried in response to his questioning tone and made what he had previously said clear.
You heard me. Wilfried did not know how to react to such information immediately. His mind thought the Duke was reading misinformation, and as such, he asked about its authenticity. Has this intelligence been verified? To Wulfried's surprise, Duke Wilmar smiled and nodded. Neither of them knew how exactly Berenger had managed to seize Tyrol so quickly, but they knew that it was an extraordinary feat. As such, they could not help but praise the young Viscount in their hearts. The only question that remained in Wulfried's mind was what they should do with such a talented commander. What will you do with him if he is victorious in Trent? Duke Wilmar continued to smile as he announced his plans to his trusted friend. I intend to make him Count of Tyrol and allow his annexation to take place. At first, this news greatly shocked Wulfried. However, he understood Wilmar's intentions. Berenger was talented in not just military matters but economic and industrial ones as well. If they could gain his favor and put him to work for the good of the realm, Austria would soar to new heights never before seen in this world. Unfortunately, the two scheming noblemen had made one minor miscalculation, and that was the fact that Berenger's ambitions did not stop at being a count. Thus he would never be content putting his innovations to use for another sovereign. However, these men had no way of knowing the depth of Berenger's goals nor the height of his pride. When the time finally came, Berenger would refuse to serve on Wilmar's council and instead develop Tyrol into a booming industry and agricultural district. While the war for Germany waged on, Berenger would elect to protect his new lands and cultivate them, allowing the chaos that the conflict caused to spread to every corner of Germany, every corner but his own. Only when things were at their worst would he have the ability to rise from the ashes of the old world and present a new alternative. As such, they continued to scheme as to how they would get into Berenger's good graces, and by doing so, they played directly into the young Viscount's hands. For Berenger would never accept the yoke of servitude beneath another being, his pride as a man would never allow it. The invasion of Trent was swift and sudden. The three-prong assault on Trent, Riva, and Persian Valsugana caught the Prince-Bishop completely off guard. Berenger gave no warning when he invaded Trent. As far as he was concerned, he was already at war with the region when they decided to supply his enemies. Due to the lack of notice, the Prince-Bishop did not have time to raise an army in defense, not even the ability to form levies. As such, he was currently surrounded in the city of Trent by Berenger's armies. As for the other key areas of assault, they could hardly even be considered cities. If anything, they were towns with a single castle. Both Eckhard and Arnulf would be able to take their regions and march on the final area with a significant population before Berenger had even completed his siege of Trent. This was a lightning war fought with limited time. Berenger had to capture the key regions before Lothar was defeated in Vienna. As such, he had ordered a constant bombardment of the enemy fortifications. While a siege camp was constructed, it was rushed into production, as Berenger did not fear the bishop's armies, who were all hiding cowardly behind the large city walls. It was not as if it mattered though. Berenger concentrated the artillery bombardments on a specific section of the wall and felt he could bring it down very quickly. As usual, Berenger's forces had fired their muskets upon the defenders on the ramparts. Those who survived the initial attack began to realize that by looking over the merlons, they were asking for death. As such, the entirety of the bombardment was rather peaceful, with only a few shots being taken every so often whenever a defender was foolish enough to stick his head out from under the protective cover. The Prince-Bishop of Trent was livid. His territory was under siege from Berenger the Accursed and his demonic hordes. He was completely and utterly trapped within the confines of his territory. The bishop's name was Ludger, and he could not think of a worse fate than being trapped inside his city walls waiting for Berenger to bring the wrath of Satan upon him. Obviously, he was not one of the bishops within the Catholic Church who supported Berenger's ideals and had used much of his power and authority to demonize the young Viscount publicly. Ludger was in the middle of screaming at his garrison's commander, who was heavily armored in the equipment a proper man-at-arms would have from the era. What do you mean the men on the ramparts do not have the ability to return fire? Just what kind of weapons is the enemy using? The commander of the garrison was utterly frightened. He had seen too many of his men gunned down by the thunderous weapons in which the enemy forces wielded. Though he recognized the possibility of the arms being used as hand cannons, he could not believe the range they were capable of. It was beyond imagination to suggest such a weapon was capable of engaging targets at over 400 yards.
I believe they are hand cannons, but your lordship, I do not understand how these weapons are capable of such range. They have a greater range of effect than even our steel crossbows. The Prince Bishop of Trent could only gnash his teeth in rage as he continued to hear the echoing thunder of the 12-pound cannons wreaking havoc upon his walls. Fearing the worst, he asked the question on his mind. What about the walls? Will they withstand the fire of the cannons? The garrison commander shook his head with a worrisome expression on his face when he told the truth. They will at most last another day. Your lordship, please, let me get you out of the city. You can take refuge in the Vatican until a force can be mustered to take back your land. Ludger was outraged at the idea of fleeing his lands and leaving it in control of Berenger the Accursed, but his garrison commander was right. If he stayed here, the heretic might have him executed as a display of force against the church. Ludger completely refused to die at the command of Berenger, and he also needed to supply the Vatican with intel he had gathered about Berenger's weapons. Whether they believed him or not, the hand cannons in Berenger's hands were far more effective than anything else seen at the time and were a great threat to any army of the era. As such, Ludger sighed heavily before accepting the commander's suggestion. Fine. We will do it your way. Make sure you and your men buy me some time. With those words spoken, the garrison commander nodded his head and saluted to the Prince Bishop. We will die defending this holy land from the heathens at our gates. With that said, a plan was put into place for the Prince Bishop of Trent to abscond into the night and flee towards the Vatican. Hopefully, Berenger's forces would be unable to capture him. Night fell, and Berenger's bombardment continued into the night to provide a distraction for the Prince Bishop's escape. The enemy defenders sallied out of the sallyport and rushed into Berenger's trench line. Ultimately, the enemy was spotted before they were even 250 yards away from the camp. As such, Berenger and his men awoke from the sound of the watchtower's bell and rushed into their equipment. This time they would not be foolish enough to leave their armor behind. As such, it took them a few minutes to get fully equipped. During this time, the muskets from the sentries within the trenches had been going off, echoing into the night as the mini-ball and musket ball projectiles shredded the oncoming attackers. Though the trenches had been rushed, there was still barbed wire in place and earthen fortifications designed to protect the soldiers within the trenches. By the time Berenger arrived at the scene, a pile of corpses stacked atop the trenches, adding a secondary barrier for the defenders to get through. The zealotry in which they had attacked the defensive trench line was something Berenger had not witnessed in quite some time. Truly, religion was a powerful force that could compel men to disregard their lives, but Berenger did not know why they decided to act this way. Berenger disregarded the thought as he rushed into the trenches with a musket that had its bayonet affixed in hand and aimed the weapon at the oncoming attackers. After getting a target in sight, he squeezed the trigger of the firearm, causing the hammer which contained the flint to fall onto the pan below and spark, thus igniting the black powder contained within the pan, which propelled the mini-ball down range and into the chest of a man-at-arms no more than 10 feet in front of him. The bullet-like projectile easily pierced through the man's coat of plates, creating a massive hole in his chest where his heart used to lie intact. Not allowing time for the soldiers to rush forward, Berengar quickly reloaded his musket alongside his soldiers as fast as he could. The enemy soldiers rushed into the trench line but were caught in barbed wire, which tangled around their armor and caught them in place long enough for the defenders to reload and fire into the ensnared enemy forces. Blood splattered across the trench line as limbs were torn apart by the impact, and gaping holes filled the enemy's abdomens and chests. Eventually, enough bodies piled up over the barbed wire, allowing the enemy to get into the trench line, where Berenger and his forces began to fight within the trenches with swords, bayonets, spears, and clubs. The trench warfare became a chaotic field as soldiers from Berenger's army clashed with the men-at-arms, using every method they could think of to defeat their enemy. However, as time went on, it became increasingly apparent that the enemy forces were outnumbered and outarmed. The enemy forces suffered heavy casualties, as the bayonets of Berenger's army were the perfect size and length to pierce through the gaps in the enemy armor. Seeing as how most of them wore mail aventails as a form of throat defense, Berenger's soldiers quickly made that the target of their bayonet thrusts, which easily pierced through the interlocked iron rings and into the throats of their opponents, ending their lives. As for Berenger's forces, aside from the levies, each was equipped with sufficient steel plate protection for their torso, thighs, neck, and head. Aside from the face or the armpits, it would prove virtually impossible to deal a lethal blow to his forces with a piercing or slashing weapon. Thus, most of Berenger's fatalities resulted from blunt trauma to the head, but this was a minimal number. By dawn, the sun had risen, and Berenger was victorious. However, it would only be after Berenger had seized the city that he would realize that the Prince Bishop had fled his lands, leaving them ripe for the taking. Despite defeating the sallying forces, a few hundred men were still defending behind the walls who refused to surrender the city. As such, the siege would go on for several more days while Berenger's allies fought their own battles for the Prince-Bishopric of Trent. A couple of days had passed since the battle in the trenches, and Berenger was growing anxious. He did not yet know when Lothar would fall, and he was trying to rush his campaign as quickly as possible. Eventually, the wall came crumbling down, and when it did, he ordered a full storming of the city. Covered by artillery fire and continuous volleys of the rifled muskets, line infantry and levies alike rushed into the gap into the wall, using whatever methods available to them to take the city. Despite the fierce assault, the defenders of the city of Trent were undeterred. Though the Prince Bishop had successfully fled, it was their duty to defend the city with their lives. Hopefully, if they did so, they could enter the gates of heaven. After all, in the eyes of the city's defenders, they were fighting against a horde of heathens who sought to bring down Christendom. Religion was a powerful tool, and the weak-minded were easily compelled to die by the propaganda of the church. Yet despite the zealotry of the forces who gave up their lives to defend against the besiegers, they quickly realized that they were vastly outnumbered. Levies crashed with man-at-arms, and line infantry fired their muskets in concentrated volleys onto the enemy positions. Blood and guts spilled across the snowy streets as the defending garrison was pushed further and further back into the city. Those more cowardly hostiles would hide in the homes of civilians, which Berenger would immediately order their clearing. Not willing to risk the lives of his soldiers, a grenade or two were lobbed into the room before busting down the door, usually resulting in not only the death of the defender but also the civilians who cowered in their homes. As the battle raged on, the lords who had submitted to Berenger's authority saw the tactics Berenger was using and were quite confused. They knew Berenger had an order not to kill unarmed civilians needlessly. Yet, here, his troops were lobbing explosives into the rooms which clearly contained such people. As such, they inquired to Berenger why he was breaking his own rules of war. Berenger stared stoically onto the battlefield, alongside the lords of the levies who entered the city alongside him. Violence, blood, and despair quickly spread to every corner of the city. Enemies' lives were taken, and many civilians were caught in the crossfire. As Berenger gazed upon the sight, he continued his lecture on the art of war for all the nearby noblemen to hear. My rules of war can be summed up in a single phrase: victory at any cost. If civilians are caught in the crossfire between two combatants, then so be it. If civilians were to take up arms and rise against me in the act of rebellion, I would take 10 heads for every rebel to prove a point. Kneel before me, or die. Those are your two choices. With those words spoken, the lords who had submitted to Berenger felt chills down their spines. However, before they could protest, Berenger began to continue his speech. For example, say there is a village, and within this village, there is a garrison of enemy soldiers or a group of rebels who have taken up arms against me, but also in the village, there are dozens, maybe hundreds of unarmed civilians who may or may not express support for the hostile forces. I have no qualms ordering a bombardment of the town and razing it to the ground to ensure the destruction of my enemies, especially if it will spare the lives of my soldiers. Berenger's concept of warfare stemmed from the fact that he was well educated on the history of warfare and tactics, as well as the fact that in his previous life, he had witnessed many young men in the service of the American armed forces losing their lives in Afghanistan, where they might have been spared if the Pentagon was not so concerned about civilian casualties. As long as a region resisted the rule of the occupying nation, in Berenger's eyes, it was considered an active war zone, and whatever cruelty was needed to bring the war to an end was completely justified. As the battle continued to wage on, but this time Berenger was not at the front lines. Instead, he lectured the nobles about his vision of warfare and which extents were justifiable and unjustifiable in the pursuit of victory. As such, Berenger decided to move on to the actions he had restricted. As long as there is resistance in a region, it is a war zone, and any measure necessary to achieve a swift victory is justifiable. However, if the enemy surrenders, they should be afforded proper dignity unless, of course, they are rebels. Rebellions cannot be tolerated, and a brutal show of force is necessary to crush the spirit of those who believe in their cause. As for the civilians in the region, once the fighting has ended, no harm should be brought to them, for at that point, you have successfully conquered the region, and they are now your subjects. There are exceptions to this, but that revolves around a series of political actions, mainly regarding colonialism, and I will not get into the complexity of that topic at this moment. As Berenger brought his rant to a close, the lords gazed upon the city, which was lit ablaze by explosives. When combined with the corpses of the enemy soldiers, and the civilians caught in the crossfire whose blood flowed into the snow-covered streets, created an image of Armageddon. When witnessing such destruction and death, Berenger turned around to face the lords with a chilling smile on his otherwise immaculate visage before asking them the question on his mind. "Are there any questions?" The several lords who had submitted to Berenger's authority and allied with him to crush the southern rebellion shook their heads in silence, with a look of horror spread across their faces. For a man to be smiling in the face of such a chaotic scene, only a monster would be able to do such a thing. Or so they thought, though Berenger was happy that his plans were progressing. Internally, he could not help but sigh to himself at the needless loss of life. If his enemies were not so stubborn and surrendered the city to him the moment the walls came down, the region's citizens would not have suffered to such a degree. Of course, the lords had no way of knowing what Berenger was thinking inside the labyrinth that was his mind, and as such, they felt an overwhelming sense of dread, inspiring them to never take up arms against the man in front of them, for in their minds Berngar was a demon in the flesh of a man. It had been over a week since the siege of Trent, and the entire region fell into Berenger's hands, but to Count Lothar, who was trapped in Vienna with no way out, he had no way of knowing that he had completely lost the home front. At this point, he was desperate to escape the city and flee towards his home, where he planned to rally the local forces and defend Innsbruck until every man, woman, and child had expended their lives in its defense. He would do whatever was necessary to ensure his own survival for as long as possible. Count Otto's forces had broken through the gates, and the city was once more thrust into chaos as Otto and his men began fighting their way through the battle-worn soldiers of Lothar's army, or what remained of it. Count Lothar, at the moment, was battling with a knight under Otto's command who was clad in full steel plate armor. The two men were both similarly equipped. However, Lothar was at a disadvantage. At the moment, he only had a long sword in his hands, which was not the most effective weapon against a knight encased in full plate. As for the knight, held a halberd in his hands and had a sword sheathed on his waist. Lothar wielded his sword with excellent skill, deflecting the oncoming blows of the polearm and rushing forward, trying to get into the gaps between the enemy armor. However, the knight was equally adept and had a significant advantage in reach. Before Lothar knew it, he found himself being pushed back by the knight's advance. Luckily for him, some of his nearby men rushed forward to aid him. However, when they arrived to help their lord, they soon realized that he had disappeared the moment the men had come to his aid and began to distract the knight. Lothar ran off in the opposite direction in a desperate attempt to flee from the city. Lothar did not have time to disguise himself. War was waging around him, and enemy forces could capture him at any moment. Thankfully, the chaos provided some anonymity in the crowd. Though he wore a tabard over his breastplate which signified his house, there were many other lords and knights, each bearing their own coat of arms. As such, the man took advantage of the chaos and fled to the eastern gate, which, as far he knew, was still under his forces' control. However, the man did not get far. As he was sprinting in the direction of the gate, cavalry began to ride into the city. These knights and lancers on horseback belonged to Count Otto. Riding at the front of the group was the loyal count himself. They noticed a heavily armed man bearing Lothar's coat of arms running away. Though it could not be seen beneath his great bassinet's visor, Otto was grinning with excitement. He had finally found the traitor, and if he could be captured alive, the battle would end sooner. Thus Otto and his knights quickly rode down any resistance in the way and rapidly caught up to Lothar. Before the traitorous count could regroup with his forces at the eastern gate, he was surrounded by Otto and his heavily armored knights. Otto did not allow for a single gap for the traitor to escape and confirm the man's identity. He called out to him. "Running away, are you? In the face of defeat, you do not have the courage to face your own death in glorious battle. For a traitor, you are quite pathetic." Lothar was resigned to his fate. Steel-clad horses and knights surrounded him. There was no path to victory nor escape. He could merely sigh and face captivity. If Lady Luck were on his side, he would be able to escape from his predicament, though he feared this was not the case. As such, he did not respond to Otto's insults. Instead, he admitted his defeat. "I know when I am beaten. Well played, Otto. I did not expect you to overcome my defenses so quickly. You can rest assured knowing that I was never capable of penetrating the castle's defenses. As far as I am aware, the Duke's family is safe and sound. Beneath the visor of his great bassinet, Count Otto sneered in disgust at the man before him, a man he once considered his own hubris now brought down his rival. As such, Otto expressed his contempt for Lothar. He ordered his arrest. "Yes, you should have been content with your lot in life. Men, arrest this traitor." With his weapon no longer in his hands, and the heavily armored knights cautiously approaching Lothar, he quickly restrained the man and cuffed him into iron shackles. They then removed his helmet to stare at the man so bold as to revolt against his liege during a time of crisis. However, what revealed itself was a haggard man, driven to exhaustion by the war he started. Lothar was merely a shadow of his former self at this point, and his appearance showed it. Otto then brought him before the fighting armies and blew a horn which gathered everyone's attention. Lothar's forces quickly saw that their liege had been captured and knew they were defeated. There was no longer a purpose in fighting. Lothar's rebellion and the war in Tyrol were over. As such, Count Otto boldly declared for all the men to hear. "I have captured your liege, surrender now, and hand over the other traitorous lords, and you will be allowed to return to your homes peacefully." The various noblemen who had followed Lothar into battle were frightened at this news and looked around anxiously through the open-face bassinets and the kettle helmets of the man-at-arms. They could see in their eyes the desire to betray their masters. As such, a skirmish quickly ensued, and Lothar's forces turned on their masters in an attempt to save their own hides. Very quickly, the ringleaders of Lothar's rebellion were either killed in the last stand against their own forces or brought forward to Count Otto, where the remainder of Lothar's forces surrendered their arms willingly. Count Otto fully intended to bring these captives to Duke Wilmar at Munich, where they would be punished accordingly by their rightful liege. He did not want to take the credit for ending the rebellion, because after all, it was his future son-in-law who had done the majority of the work. By rapidly conquering Tyrol, Berenger cut off any form of support or reinforcements in which Lothar might receive on his quest to become Duke of Austria. This was not Berenger's only noteworthy feat, for the young Viscount had also managed to send significant material aid to Otto's forces as he laid siege to Lothar's defenses. If not for this aid, he would not have been able to so swiftly retake the city, which was the Duke's seat of power. The impression of his future son-in-law grew exponentially in Otto's heart, and he had at this point practically forgiven Berenger's infidelity. As the siege of Vienna ended and the traitors captured, so too did the war in Austria. For now, Austria would find some semblance of peace in the upcoming months. With the entire German world at war and the conflict spreading to the rest of the empire, it would only be a matter of time before violence found its way back into the Duchy of Austria. When that happened, Berenger's position would be in a far better position to confront any army which entered the lands of Austria. Berenger's army, or what remained of it, had been marching since he successfully annexed the Prince-Bishopric of Trent into the county of Tyrol. It had been weeks at this point, and he could finally see the city of Kufstein and its impregnable defenses on the horizon. It had been over 2 months since he first began his campaign, and he had achieved an overwhelming victory against the rebellious forces. A warm smile appeared on the handsome youth's face as he gazed upon his homeland with delight, muttering the words on his mind beneath his breath as he sat atop his war steed, which had proven to be an excellent companion during the last 2 months of his life. "We are finally home." Berenger's losses in the war were quite low. Less than 1,000 men on his side had perished in the conflict. As for the levies that were allied with him, their number was a bit higher. Still, he did not count them among his own casualties, as they were technically not his forces at the moment. As for the army behind his back, it was less than half of what he had invaded Trent with. The region was given command by Arnulf temporarily until a time in which the rebellion had officially ended. As for Eckhard, he was in charge of South Tyrol and its garrisons. The spirit of resistance was still within the hearts of many citizens who Berenger had conquered in this time, but at the moment, they did not act upon it. Once the war was officially over, Eckhard, Arnulf, and the forces left behind in the region would remain there until a more permanent garrison comprised of locals who had properly been indoctrinated into his army was established. It had been 2 months since he felt his lover's warm embrace, or since he saw the dazzling sapphire eyes of his baby boy, and Berenger had missed them greatly. As such, when he rode into the city, which was currently covered in snow, he had a large smile on his face. When Berenger and his forces entered the city of Kufstein, the citizens of the city lined up across the streets, welcoming the return of their liege as a conquering hero. Cheers echoed across the city as Berenger rode at the front of his army, dressed in his garishly decorated black and steel plate armor.
Berenger had thought to himself as he smiled and waved at his subjects. So this is a hero's welcome? It is truly fitting. To the citizens of Kufstein, Berenger had accomplished the unthinkable. He spread the glory of their territory and captured the entirety of the county Tyrol and its neighbor, the Prince Bishopric of Trent, from their enemies in a span of 2 months. Though many of his men had died in the conflict, Berenger would keep his promise and exempt their families from taxes for a duration of time. However, the people of Kufstein did not know about this promise yet. After riding through the streets of Kufstein, Berenger dismissed his armies. They could return home to their loved ones for the time being. After all, they had more than earned it. It was only after his army fully gathered into ranks and fully saluted Berenger at Kufstein Castle's steps that he understood the extent of their loyalty. Such a performance was not asked of them, yet they took it upon themselves to salute their lord and commander, who had to lead them against unthinkable odds and into an overwhelming victory. Berenger returned their salute before marching into the castle's gates. The moment Berenger stepped through the gates of his castle, he was practically mowed over by Linda, who rushed into his arms like a charging bull. Luckily for him, he was capable of standing his ground and accepted her embrace. Her family, as well as Henrietta, had gathered nearby and witnessed the loving reunion. Berenger began to greet Linda. Did you miss? Before he could even finish his sentence, Berenger's lover had pressed her lips against his own and parted them with her tongue in a passionate display of affection. Her siblings were quite shocked by her boldness and watched in embarrassment for some time as the two continued to fondle one another openly. It was only when Berenger reached for Linda's substantial breasts that someone decided to spoke up. Liatbert grunted to signal to the couple that they had company, and we were quickly getting out of hand. Realizing that her siblings were watching, Linda quickly retracted herself from Berenger's embrace and looked down with embarrassment. Her cheeks were completely flushed at this point, and she could not help but be ashamed of her actions. Berenger, on the other hand, smiled and licked his lips before greeting Linda and the others. So I guess that's a yes? Afterward, he quickly grabbed a hold of Linda's waist and dragged her over to the others. Linda's siblings each had a different expression on their faces. Adelheid considered Berenger to be a womanizer taking advantage of her big sister, but she knew he was capable of achieving great things and had helped topple her father's dastardly plans. As such, she was conflicted with how to treat the man in front of her. Liatbert had already chosen to submit to Berenger and gracefully welcomed the man that would become the next Count of Tyrol. He had already received news of Lothar's defeat at Vienna. After becoming aware of his father's defeat, Liatbert finally realized that he had made the right choice in supporting Berenger. As for Hermann, he was acting like a stubborn little brat, greatly scowling at the man who had rebelled against his father. The little misfit could not help but blame Berenger for the defeat and captivity of his father. Linda also had one other sibling, a little sister, roughly Henrietta's age, and this girl was named Minna, and she was rather welcoming to Berenger. Minna had grown close to Henrietta throughout the past month of captivity in Kufstein, and Henrietta had filled her ears with stories of Berenger and his gallant acts. Berenger did not even need to sway the little girl to his side, as she had already developed the image of Berenger being a knight in shining armor. From how Henrietta talked about his past, he seemed like some form of Prince Charming. As such, she was happy to finally see the man she admired, and his good looks did not disappoint. Henrietta, of course, was beaming with a smile on her face as her elder brother returned home alive. With her parents retiring to the countryside and Lambert exiled, Berenger was her only family left, and she greatly dreaded some misfortune that might befall him. In her hands was the baby Hans, which she spent a great deal of time looking after, considering in his absence Linda was forced to deal with the civil affairs of Kufstein. Seeing his infant son in Henrietta's hands, Berenger walked over to her and grabbed a hold of his child. Hans, your father has returned. With that, Berenger held onto his child, surrounded by loved ones and allies. He felt completely safe for the first time in what appeared to him like a lifetime of war. As such, a grand feast was thrown that night to celebrate his return, and he had begun to invite his friends throughout Kufstein to partake in it. During the extravagant meal, which tasted like ambrosia straight from the mouth of God after having eaten nothing but bread and salted pork for 2 months, Berenger forced himself to stop stuffing his face and made a victory toast. Everyone expected him to say something valiant, something bold, or a declaration of future prospects. Instead, Berenger merely lifted his glass and said the somber words that had plagued his mind since the combat began. To our fallen warriors. May they forever rest in peace.
The serious toast brought the excited audience out of their celebratory mood and forced them back to reality. Every victory was paved with the blood of the dead and those brave men who fought on the front lines. The fact that Berenger had used that as a toast undoubtedly killed the mood, but it also achieved the effect he was hoping for. It reminded everyone around him of the price of victory. Weeks passed, and while Berenger was acclimating to the peaceful environment of Kufstein after having been at war for so long, Count Lothar and his rebel supporters were being dragged to Munich, which had recently been captured by Duke Wilmar, where they waited for Count Otto's return before marching on Landshut. Inside a carriage designed to hold prisoners, Lothar sat in the corner, his back resting against the cold iron bars as he struggled for warmth. The ice-cold air of winter permeated between the gaps of the iron bars and sucked the heat from his body. Beside him were his vassals who had supported him in his rebellion, or at least the few who survived the disastrous siege of Vienna. Lothar's face had not changed since his capture. He had been scowling ever since, thinking over what he could have done to achieve victory. As he stared into space, he overheard the knights tasked with escorting his prison carriage, mocking him. "The mighty Count Lothar, look at him now. Defeated at Vienna, having his lands usurped by an upstart viscount, even his own son and heir denounced him and his actions. Pathetic." These words stirred Lothar from his stupor. He had not been aware of what happened outside of Vienna as he and his forces were trapped inside the city walls during the majority of Berenger's conquest of Tyrol. He quickly rose from his seat and climbed over to the area where the guards were talking, peering at them. However, the flat of a sword quickly smacked upon his hands as he grasped a hold of the iron bars, forcing him back into the cage. This action instantly provoked the laughter of the knights as they mocked the pitiful position the once mighty Count Lothar had fallen to. However, Lothar did not care about that. He needed to know what happened to his home. As such, he quickly asked the knights about the information. "What you said. Is it true?" The knights nodded and grinned as they chastised Lothar for his failure. They were all too happy to provide him with the information about what happened to his home while he was trapped in Vienna. "Some people are calling Berenger a war saint. The man led a small army of 5,000 men and conquered all of Tyrol and the nearby Prince-Bishopric of Trent in a little over 2 months. Innsbruck was the second place to fall to him. After capturing your family and dragging them back to Kufstein, your son Liutbert denounced you and your treachery. He even pledged his loyalty to Berenger, going so far as to proclaim him a man worthy of your title. Your own family thinks of you as nothing more than a backstabbing scoundrel." Naturally, the rumors had inflated Berenger's victory. If not for the conscripts which added 5,000 men to his armies and the thousands of levies who fought beside him, he would not have so rapidly seized the territory. However, it was still quite the feat, one which was mostly achieved through superior firepower. Lothar was shocked by this news and struggled to come to terms with it. The incessant mocking which followed completely went unnoticed by the traitorous count. Instead, he sunk back into the corner of his cell and began to piece together what had led to his downfall. In a masterful move by Berenger, his own daughter turned against him, luring a quarter of his army to their certain deaths. Where Berenger then waged a lightning war in Tyrol, cutting off all support from arriving in Vienna, which was practically on the other side of the duchy. By being overeager, an overambitious Lothar had left himself completely shut off from his allies back in his own territory and left them to fend for themselves against a powerful foe. With no support, and a large chunk of his forces missing, Otto was able to trap him and defeat his forces with ease. Count Lothar sighed heavily. He fully realized the faults he had made in this war. They stemmed from a combination of being a poor father, underestimating his enemies, and immediately going for the enemy capital without establishing a supply line. Only now he realized why Berenger had sold him such high-quality equipment for such a fair price. Because Berenger had already outfitted his own soldiers with some form of armor and weaponry far superior to what he was selling. Berenger had outmaneuvered him at every turn. The worst part of it all was that Count Lothar was not even mad. What he felt was overwhelming respect for how Berenger had played him since the beginning. After reflecting on his life choices in silence for some time, the carriage finally pulled into the city square of Munich, where a platform was constructed in the middle of the area. Soldiers and civilians alike had gathered to witness the event, and upon seeing the platform, Lothar instantly realized what awaited him. He and his allies would be beheaded publicly for all to witness. The moment the carriage stopped, the other lords within the cell began to panic and struggle, yet they were all pulled out one at a time by the knights and brought up to the platform. Though they were not able to see the results, everyone knew what was happening, and as such, they did everything they could to escape. All except for Lothar, who sat in his corner with cold, dead eyes. He had already accepted what was to come. Over an hour passed, and finally, he was all that remained within the carriage when the guards came to escort him. He did not even resist in the slightest. He wobbled onto the platform with a defeated expression and gazed upon the crowd who jeered him and threw produce and cow pies at him. By the time he reached the chopping block, he was already covered in filth, not that he was in pristine condition before. As standing in the crowd was Duke Wilmar, who was fully armored and surrounded by his houseguard. A chilling smile was on his face as he stared into Count Lothar's lifeless eyes as the man was placed headfirst onto the chopping block. Finally, Count Otto began reading his charges, who announced his crimes to the realm and his sentence. Count Lothar, for the crimes of rebelling against your liege and laying siege to his lands in an attempt to usurp his position, you are hereby found guilty and sentenced to death. You and your family's lands and titles are hereby forfeit, or they shall be henceforth be granted to Viscount Berenger von Kufstein and his family for perpetuity. May God have mercy on your soul. Hearing that last part, a bitter smile formed on Lothar's face as he stared into Duke Wilmar's eyes. In the end, Lothar had lost everything, and the young Viscount, who started as a baron's son, who Lothar once believed to be a sickly fool, had inherited his position. It was truly a fitting end. The last thing Lothar saw as the executioner's blade came swinging down upon his neck was the sight of a violent crowd cursing him to damnation and the shocked expression on Wilmar's face when he realized that Lothar was smiling. Afterward, everything faded black for Count Lothar, and his head was separated from his shoulders. His blood pooled out from the gaping hole in his neck where his head once belonged. The rebellion was over, Berenger had won, and was now officially declared a count. Lothar would forever be remembered as a stepping stone on Berenger's rise to power. News quickly spread of Count Lothar's execution and the forfeiture of his lands in favor of Berenger and his dynasty. In the years since Berenger had been reincarnated into this world, he had gone from a lowly baron's son to the Count of Tyrol. The young man was quite satisfied with his accomplishments, and despite his grand ambitions to unify the German-speaking regions, he knew these plans could not be rushed. As such, while the rest of Germany was at war, Berenger was tasked by Duke Wilmar to protect Tyrol from potential enemy advances through the Bavarian Alps, which he was more than happy to do. Now was the time for expansion, not just in military matters but industrial, agricultural, and educational sectors as well. Thus Berenger was hard at work putting through a series of executive orders, which allowed him to bypass the rudimentary parliament he had constructed. As per usual, the parliamentary system was more symbolic than it was practical. Their practical purpose was to decrease the workload on Berenger's shoulders, while symbolically, they represented the people's interests. The first matter of business was to change the capital of Tyrol to Kufstein with a stroke of a quill. The city that had been the political and economic center of the region for centuries had been shifted to Berenger's homeland. As for industrial expansion, it was time to create a second industrial city. Innsbruck was perfect for the role. It was nearby and maintained by a loyal member of what he considered to be his family. After all, Lietbert was his lover's brother. Thus he was practically an in-law. Berenger had made Lietbert the Viscount of Innsbruck and his chancellor, at least until a time where he could expand his power and make the man a proper count like he was born to be. As such, he tasked the man with leading the charge to reform Innsbruck's defenses, industry, and agriculture. As for military concerns, Berenger had begun to spread his military reforms across the entire region. Due to the number of men who had died in the Civil War, there were not many men-at-arms left to oppose him, and those that remained would not have the guts to do so. Though the lords of Tyrol were greatly outraged by the military reforms which stripped their feudal powers to raise their own forces, there was not much they could do as their armies were exhausted, and they knew the power Berenger had in his hands. As such, young men of military age began being conscripted across the region and sent to Berenger's training facilities to be indoctrinated into his military. They would undergo political indoctrination as a part of their training. It was a system designed to break down the old identity of the feudal regions among his forces, enforce the idea of a German nation, and ensure loyalty to Berenger and his dynasty. Once the lords had time to lick their wounds, they would undoubtedly prepare for rebellion. After all, the stripping of certain parts of their feudal powers was not a popular reform, even among the nobility of his own region. Though the local nobles of Kufstein had come to accept these reforms, the rest of the Tyrolean noblemen would not be so easily persuaded. Not only did Berenger have to prepare to put down a future rebellion, but he also had to prepare for the Teutonic invasion that is currently marching towards his borders. Speaking of which, Linda had a report in her hands, which she placed on Berenger's desk. With Berenger's return, she had resumed her position as his spymaster, but in reality, she spent most of her time looking after their child. However, at the moment, the child was with Henrietta while she informed Berenger of the latest news regarding the Teutonic army marching on their borders. They have doubled their numbers through their marches. The moment they entered German territories, they began forcefully conscripted levies from the regions they passed by. Considering the majority of the Holy Roman Empire was in chaos at the moment, nobody has been able to stop them from doing so. Though the levies are not well equipped, they can be used as cannon fodder to overrun our numbers. At the rate we are currently going, we will be able to field a small division of between 10,000 and 15,000 men when they reach our borders. However, that will be less than half of the Teutonic army's numbers by the time they enter Tyrol. Unless we resort to drafting men from the garrisons, it will be a tough battle. Berenger contemplated Linda's words carefully. The Teutonic army started with 10,000 men. Still, now they were at roughly 20,000 men with several more months of marching before they reached Tyrol. At the rate of their expansion, they will easily have 30,000 men by the time they arrived at his borders. However, if he transferred men from the garrisons he stationed across Tyrol, he would be inviting the lords of Tyrol to take advantage of the crisis against him and start a rebellion, forcing him into a two-war front. He could never allow this to happen. There were two options on Berenger's hands: lure the enemy into Kufstein, where he could use the near-impenetrable city walls to his advantage, or confront them in a field battle while being heavily outnumbered. Such a battle would be massive and would undoubtedly result in melee combat. Berenger's greatest advantage would be to field rifled muskets in large numbers and wear down the enemy forces at a distance with gunfire and artillery shells before they finally clashed. As such, he came to a decision and announced his plan to Linda. If we withdraw forces from our garrisons to increase our field army, the result would be an unmitigated disaster. Therefore I will confront the Teutonic army in the field with as many men as we can muster. As though Linda feared this would be the option Berenger would take, deep down, she knew he would never hide behind Kufstein's walls while the Teutonic order ravaged his land. She merely sighed as she listened to Berenger as he explained his plans. I will increase the conversion and production of 141,718 rifled muskets and will seek to draw the enemy forces to an area whose terrain gives me an advantage. With this, we have a much higher chance of defeating the enemy. Inform the spies to continue monitoring the Teutonic forces. I want to know about any potential growth as quickly as possible. Linda nodded her head in response and smiled. Of course, Master, anything for you. With that said, Linda was dismissed, and Berenger returned to the pile of work on his hands. After returning to a mountain of paperwork, he greatly missed the days of battle where he was free to act as he pleased. Nevertheless, accounts work was never finished, and Tyrol greatly needed agricultural, industrial, and economic reforms. As such, he quickly got back to signing executive orders that would one day transform Tyrol into the seat of power of the future German Empire. In Graz, Adela currently sat at her desk reading a letter in her hands which Berenger wrote. As usual, it expressed his desire to meet up with his young fiancée, and of course, he boasted about his achievements in battle. The fact that Berenger had become a count greatly pleased the teenage youth. It meant that she would become a countess, much like her mother once she married Berenger. Though she knew Berenger was destined for great things, she had no idea that she would be empress of a unified German empire one day. As such, she was content with Berenger's gains and knew he was most likely dreadfully busy consolidating his power. Adela was not aware that the Teutonic order was marching on Tyrol and had no worries about Berenger's immediate future. He was home, and he was safe, and that was all that mattered to the young girl. She had greatly desired to visit Kufstein, but in a time such as this that was filled with chaos and uncertainty, the roads to her fiancé's home would not be safe. Thus, despite her protests, she was locked away in the castle of Graz under her family's orders. As far as she was aware, her father, Count Otto, had marched with Duke Wilmar's forces onto Landshut after capturing Munich, which was the seat of the Duke of Bavaria's power. The war in Bavaria had entered a new stage of intensity as the Duke of Bavaria was outraged by the fact that his home had been seized. Luckily for him, his family had fled the city before it was fully captured and were staying with a loyal lord in a safer region of his territory. However, despite this, the Duke of Bavaria marched half of his forces from the north back into Bavaria to halt the advance of the Austrian host which had invaded his lands. To Adela, the war was inconsequential as, aside from some fighting in Tyrol and Vienna, it had not yet spread to the borders of Austria. Even if it had, Berenger's mighty army was essentially the home defenders while the Duke was off fighting with his main army in Bavaria. If Graz were to ever come under siege, Berenger would surely come to her rescue. After thinking about her situation, Adela wrote a letter back to Berenger congratulating him on his gains and impressive victory. She also expressed her desire to see him again but explained her current circumstances that prevented such a reunion. By the time she had finished writing it, the message was nothing more than a love letter that resembled that which was written by a young girl to her crush. However, shortly after finishing writing her love letter to her fiancé, Adela heard a knock on her door, which startled her, spilling her ink container all over the letter and thoroughly ruining it. She was greatly displeased by this event but had no way of controlling it as such. She rapidly cleaned up the mess before storming over to the door with a pouting expression on her face. After opening the door, Adela noticed her eldest sister standing in the doorway. She was roughly the age of Berenger and had long since been married to the son of another count within Austria. In fact, the young woman known as Eva von Salzburg had not been to her family's home in quite some time and was quite excited to see her youngest sister and how much she had grown. After all, she lived with her husband and 3 children in Salzburg, Austria, where she was married to the count's eldest son. Seeing how much Adela had grown over the years, the beautiful and busty woman that was Adela's older sister quickly grabbed a hold over the little girl and squeezed her tightly with a wide grin on her face. "Little Adela, you have grown so much." Adela struggled to get out of her eldest sister's grasp, but unfortunately, she could not break free from the tight grip that encompassed her and nearly suffocated as her tiny heart-shaped face was stuffed into Eva's massive cleavage. It was only after Adela ended her resistance to the hug that the tall and curvy woman finally released her grasp. Afterward, Adela backed away from her overly affectionate big sister and pouted, which quickly led to Eva noticing that something was going on in the background. She quickly deduced that there was an ink-stained sheet of paper, and when Eva noticed the look on Adela's face, she quickly smiled sinisterly and began to tease her little sister. "Adela, were you perhaps writing a love letter? I heard that you have gotten yourself quite the capable fiancé." Adela's cute face quickly flushed with embarrassment as she immediately denied the allegations in the most obvious attempt to cover up her actions. "Of course not. Why would I write such a thing?" Seeing her little sister acting so sheepishly, Eva licked her lips like a wolf gazing at its prey and advanced closer to Adela before whispering in her ear, "I heard he is really handsome. Do you mind if I have a taste?" Eva was not genuinely interested in Berenger as she was happily married. Her husband was decent-looking enough and came from a high noble family, whereas Berenger was merely an upstart. Despite this, Eva could not resist the urge to tease Adela and make her angry. Adela, of course, instantly fell into Eva's trap and behaved exactly as the sly woman had expected. She pushed Eva away and began yelling at her while throwing a little tantrum. "Absolutely not. You are disgusting. Why would you even suggest something like that?" Seeing that Adela had reacted so adorably to her joke, Eva went in for the kill. She just loved the cute expression on Adela's face when she was angry. "Why not? We are siblings after all, it is only natural for us to share. After all, I heard that fiancé of yours already has a mistress, so clearly, you are not against the idea of sharing your man." This touched on Adela's reverse scale. She was fine sharing Berenger with Linda since the 2 young women had come to some degree of an arrangement, but she absolutely would never allow her big sister to lay claim to her man. Of course, if Adela knew that Eva was teasing her, and in reality, looked down on her for marrying a man from a family of such low nobility, she would only be more infuriated as such. Her response to Eva's provocation was far more civil than it could have been. "Get out of my room, Eva, I have no interest in having this conversation with you and your filthy mind." Thus Adela struggled to push her eldest sister out of her room, which continued to tease Adela on her way out. "So, come on. You are being unfair." Just one bite, and with that last remark, Eva was forced out of her room, and the door was slammed behind her. While Adela was fuming inside her quarters, sitting with her back to the door and her face resting on her knees. Ava was smiling in excitement on the opposite side of the thick wooden door. After all, her little sister was just too cute when provoked in such a manner. With a relatively stable peace encapsulating the mountainous region of Tyrol following Berenger's conquest, the young count took the time to establish the construction of several monuments since his return. Each monument was crafted for different aspects of propaganda. The first of these monuments to be constructed was intended to represent the personal glory and authority of Berenger von Kufstein. The monument was constructed on a similar scale and design to that of the Hermannsdenkmal statue from Germany in Berenger's previous life. The monument was placed on a hill above the city of Kufstein, which overlooked its region as an eternal guardian. The large statue was meticulously crafted out of bronze to represent Berenger's figure perfectly. The statue itself was designed with Berenger mounted upon his trusty steed Erwin, though the horse itself lacked his barding, and Berenger was dressed in his exquisite three-quarters plate armor. With a pair of cavalry boots that went up to the knees of his Landsknecht-like attire, the statue was designed without Berenger's Waffenrock, his iron skullcap, and feathered cap. In one hand, Berenger held his 1417 heavy cavalry saber and pointed it in the direction of the city of Rome. The position of the statue, and especially that of its sword, was a twofold statement. First and foremost, brandishing his sword towards Rome represented the ancient Germanic people's struggle against the Roman Empire. The second meaning behind it was a sign of resistance towards the papacy and its corruption, as well as a provocation towards Berenger's personal enemy, being Pope Simeon II. Nearly a month had passed since Berenger returned from Tyrol, and during that time, the construction of this grand monument was finished. When it was finally complete, Berenger stood before the symbol and smiled. It was truly a magnificent piece of art and showed that the level of craftsmanship of his people was beginning to advance to the era of the Renaissance. After all, Berenger had inspired his people to take up the arts. However, he himself could never teach art as he was woefully inept at the subject. He could at least create a society that allowed artisans and craftsmen to explore the depths of their talent. The fact that the statue was so grand proved that he had made the right decision to spend a small portion of the treasury to subsidize artists and craftsmen with great potential. Standing next to Berenger gazing upon the magnificent display was Linda, who was holding her child in her hands. She gazed between the immaculate facial features of her lover and that of his statue and praised the work. "It looks exactly like you." Berenger's grin could not get any wider. For so long this medieval world was devoid of any form of advanced art. Since the collapse of the Roman Empire, the art of the European world had suffered greatly, regressing to a laughable point, and yet for the first time in centuries a grand creation had taken place in Europe that was on par with the major works of classical antiquity. He could not contain the excitement he had for the other monuments being constructed. If his personal statue turned out this well, then the others should be even more grandiose. After staring at his own statue, Berenger finally responded to Linda's claim with a nod. "It is marvelous. I did not expect it to turn out so well. Truly the talent I have fostered over the past few months has been worth it." Berenger was not exaggerating about taking some degree of credit for the project. After all, it was his vision that had come into reality, and without his economic support, the artists of his territory would not be able to afford to improve their skills full-time. Though Berenger lacked the ability to create art itself, his mind was filled with creative ideas that could be expanded upon and turned into masterpieces when explained to a proper artisan. Berenger would never take full credit for the masterpiece. In his eyes, he supplied a basic outline of the project, and the funding needed to achieve it, which he believed to be a minimal contribution. The credit of such a magnificent monument and the glory that came with it was left entirely in the hands of the artisans and craftsmen who brought it into this world. The lead designer of the statue walked over to Berenger and noticed the Count's wide grin. As such, he was greatly pleased to see that Berenger enjoyed the piece. However, he still felt like asking if it turned out as Berenger had wished. As such, he voiced his thoughts. "I hope it is to your liking, Your Excellency." Berenger immediately snapped back to reality after being entranced by the monument, went up to the project lead, and happily shook his hand. "Gerlach, you and your team have really outdone yourselves. It is truly inspiring. This monument will stand as a testament to the power of our people for centuries to come." Though the man named Gerlach knew that the statue was more related to Berenger's personal prestige and the authority of his dynasty, it was still great to hear such praise. In truth, this was not the only project Gerlach was working on. He was also overseeing the construction of the monument dedicated to those who had fallen in Schwaz, which was being constructed on the site of the ambush in which Berenger and his forces had suffered on that cold winter's night. As such, the man discussed the progress with the other monument with which he was tasked. "I am glad to hear that Your Excellency is pleased. I want to inform you that the monument to the fallen soldiers at Schwaz is fully under construction and will be finished in a few months." Due to the much larger scale of the monument in Schwaz, Berenger was pleased with the time frame. However, he did not have the time to enjoy the statue any longer. He was needed back in Kufstein. As such, the young count addressed the artisan before departing. "Excellent. Keep up the good work. I expect great things from you. However, I am needed elsewhere, so I am afraid we must save the rest of this conversation for another time. I wish you the best of luck in your endeavors." With that said, Berenger and Linda left the monument and enjoyed their stroll back to the castle in Kufstein. He had a lot of work to do when he returned, and as such, he enjoyed the brief time he had with his lover before he threw himself back into an endless pile of paperwork. The Teutonic Order was rapidly advancing onto Kufstein, and it would be within the borders of Tyrol shortly. At this point, Berenger had at most 2 months before they arrived, and preparations needed to be made. As such, Berenger would be extremely busy in the coming months. An army bearing the legendary white field with the black cross upon it marched through the town of Suhl. The Teutonic Order was close to the region of Bavaria. After making their stop in Suhl and resupplying, the army would advance forwards through the Bavarian Alps and into Tyrol, where they would raze Berenger's lands to the ground. Or at least that was the plan. Currently, the Teutonic Order was conscripting as many men from the town as possible into their army. Young or old, as long as they were capable of bearing arms, they were stripped from the towns the Teutonic army visited and placed into their ranks as levies. In the middle of the town, a scene displayed itself as a 13-year-old boy was dragged away from his mother's arms and lined up into the ranks of the new levies. The mother begged with tears to knights who had snatched her child, yet for all her effort, the woman was only rewarded with a swift kick to the stomach, dropping her to her knees as she bawled in misery. Across this town and every village, the Teutonic Order had come across similar scenes such as this had become the norm. The ruthlessness of the Teutonic army under Lambert's command knew no bounds, and they were even willing to slaughter the families of those who refused to join the service of their great crusade. Though this village was different than the others in which they previously passed. As the cruelty of the Teutonic Order was displayed for the villagers to see, some of them began to gather. The townsfolk quickly formed a mob that began to berate the Teutonic soldiers who had forcefully taken their sons and fathers away from them. What started as a peaceful protest quickly resulted in a full-scale riot. The townsfolk began to push and shove the soldiers of the Teutonic Order and throw produce and filth in their directions. Things were beginning to spiral out of control when Lambert arrived on horseback. Seeing the lowly peasants dare to defy his orders, Lambert got off of his horse and took off his great bassinet, revealing his charming face for all to see. The solution to this problem was simple. He would preach how it was the will of God for the men of this village to embark on a holy crusade to put down the heretics in Tyrol. Berenger's reformation had already begun to spread rapidly. Words of Berenger's rapid conquest of Tyrol had spread quickly and had been taken as a sign of divine retribution against the traitor Lothar. However, Lambert was more concerned with bringing down his brother and ending his rise to power than he was with fulfilling the duties of his task to end the Berenger heresy in its entirety. As such, he took a diplomatic approach and approached the angry mob, attempting to placate them with a sermon. "Citizens of Suhl, I understand your complaints, but our order is on a mission from the Pope himself. We require the assistance of every man and youth capable of bearing arms to bring down the wretched Berenger heresy which has begun to fester in these lands. Only by cutting off the head of the serpent known as Berenger the Accursed can the will of God be restored to these lands." Lambert did not know that many of the townsfolk were what would later become known as German reformists, and they held Berenger in high regard. As such, a courageous young man who appeared to be a wealthy merchant or the son of one stood before the crowd and began to defend Berenger in front of the Teutonic Order, who had been tasked with his elimination. "Who are you to declare Berenger a heretic? I have read the Bible, which he has translated into our language, and given the ability for all men, regardless of their birth, the ability to comprehend the Word of God. Not a single one of his views and that of the priest Ludolf goes against the teachings of Christ as is written in the Scripture. If anything, it is the Pope who is the heretic, as many of the claims of the Catholic Church are not written in the word of the apostles or Christ himself. Berenger is a pious and enlightened man who acts against the corruption of the ecclesiarchy, and for that, you all wish to silence him.
Have you no guilt?" As the man spoke, the entirety of the mob began to agree with him and further chastised the Teutonic Order for their actions. If anything, they were even more outraged now that they knew the intentions of this army and were unwilling to stand by and do nothing when such a large army was tasked with hunting down the head of their reformation. Quickly things got out of hand, and Lambert was not handling it well. Hearing the villagers take Berenger's side enraged him to his very core. How could Berenger's influence reach so far that these filthy peasants were willing to defy the authority of the Teutonic Order and, by extension, the papacy? This was outrageous. As Lambert was fuming with anger, a small child threw a cow pie in his face and shouted at him. "Go away, you evil men!" With this action, something snapped in Lambert's mind, and he instinctively gripped the hilt of his sword where he quickly unsheathed the blade sword. In a smooth chopping motion he cut off the head of the child, who was no older than 8. The head of the child slowly rolled on the floor as blood sprayed onto Lambert's white tabard. A loud shriek filled the air, which belonged to the child's mother, who just witnessed her own son get decapitated before her eyes. As horrified and enraged by Lambert's actions, the mob quickly clashed with the soldiers of the Teutonic Order. They were no longer thinking rationally and had decided in the heat of the moment to enact justice on these heavily armed and well-trained soldiers. Seeing that the mob had taken up arms against him, Lambert sneered in disdain and gave the order above the crowd's shouts to the men under his command. "This village is filled with heretics, kill them all and burn the town to ashes. God wills it." Despite witnessing their commanding officer murder a child in cold blood, not a single one of the fanatic soldiers of the Teutonic Order cared, for, in their minds, the little boy was a heretic and deserved his fate. Instead, they all raised their weapons and began to massacre the townsfolk. Their victims could see the fierce zealotry contained within their eyes as the Crusaders screamed their war chant over and over again. God wills it. With that, the entire population of Suhl was massacred, their town was burned to the ground, and the perpetrators confiscated their grain and livestock. By morning there would not be a single soul left alive within the confines of the once proud town. Only blood and ash would remain. The snow on the ground began to melt as spring had begun to arrive. Throughout Berenger's winter campaign, he had dealt with many difficulties, but as the breath of life filled the air around him, he felt as if he was embarking upon a new world. In front of him was a small village within the borders of the Viscounty of Kufstein. It was one of the many small villages throughout his homeland. Around this village, which housed a few hundred people, were the steel-reinforced concrete brick walls in the formation of a star fortress similar to those surrounding Kufstein. Throughout his war for Tyrol, Linda did not disappoint Berenger. As the person responsible for maintaining Berenger's plans while he was away, she had overseen the construction of star fortresses around the Viscounty of Kufstein, and after many months nearly all of them were complete. The value of these mighty bastions and the cannons mounted upon them could not be underestimated. After all, they had played a critical role in the defense of Kufstein against Lothar's forces. Beside Berenger was one of the men in charge of these construction efforts, and he gazed at the structure with a proud gleam in his eyes. As such, he could not prevent himself from commenting on the powerful defenses of such a small and seemingly insignificant agricultural village. Magnificent, is it not? Berenger nodded with approval as he took in the sight of the structure. While the village itself was protected by the mighty Start fortress, which a company of soldiers garrisoned, the agricultural fields were outside the walls, creating a beautiful scene of planted fields and fortification. Berenger's ambitions did not end with Kufstein. He intended to construct these mighty fortresses around every major inhabited region within Tyrol, forming the mountainous county into the heartland of his future German Empire. The expense would be great, but with the increase in territory he had gained and the plethora of natural resources, he could afford to build it. Berenger rode into the town on horseback, surrounded by a group of cuirassiers who acted as his personal guard for the moment. It was a small agricultural town, yet its walls made it seem like an important fortress. The locals peacefully coexisted with the garrison tasked with defending them, oftentimes offering them food and water as they stood guard among the ramparts of the mighty concrete walls. When the local villagers noticed that the man riding through their village was the Count of Tyrol himself, they instantly cleared a path for him out of respect. Many young women began to gossip among themselves as they were able to witness the majestic appearance of the infamous Berenger firsthand. Among the population of the Viscounty of Kufstein, Berenger had become quite the legend. His rise to power and defiance of the corruption of the church had begun being spread by wandering minstrels.
Though these bardic epics greatly exaggerated his achievements, they quickly captured the imagination of the common populace, acting as a source of inspiration in their daily lives. However, despite the good light in which he was depicted in these songs, few were bold enough to approach Berenger, as he was a man of great importance and power, and to offend him would surely mean one's demise, or so they believed. Berenger noticed this trend, and for the first time, began to realize that a sense of respect for his character had been fostered among his people. Still, it existed alongside an intense feeling of fear towards his power and prestige. The two emotions coexisted perfectly to create a harmonious balance within the minds of his citizens. To be both feared and respected was a balance few had ever achieved in life, and yet that was what Berenger had begun to cultivate in the wake of his overwhelming victories. After reaching the town center, Berenger dismounted from his horse and looked around at the environment. Despite having a garrison of 120 infantry and an artillery battery, the walls were designed so that such a small force could easily defend the village long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Though it may take years, or possibly even decades to achieve, one day Tyrol would be filled with such fortifications, making it virtually impossible for the armies of this world to dethrone Berenger in his seat of power. Berenger knew that the more territory he conquered, the more he would have to spend time and effort introducing his reforms in his lifetime. He would be lucky to industrialize the entirety of his future empire. In fact, the likelihood was that he would leave behind a legacy of industrialization for his successors to accomplish. Nevertheless, Berenger would make sure that in this life, he would unite the German-speaking regions into a single empire and conquer enough colonies overseas to secure German hegemony for centuries to come. As Berenger gazed upon this beautiful agricultural town, which was just one of many throughout Tyrol. It may not have seemed like it would play a key component in his plans, but the fortifications that surrounded this village and one day the majority of Tyrol would give him the internal stability needed to focus his efforts on conquest for years to come. After looking at the degree of security that allowed the people of this town to live in a happy and carefree environment, despite a massive war going on, Berenger realized that the expense of expanding this project to encompass all of the inhabited regions of Tyrol was well worth it. Without such a powerful defense network, these villagers who went about their daily tasks with a friendly smile might be subjected to the horrors of war. A reality in which Berenger thought was far too cruel for the good people of his realm. As such, Berenger looked over at the architect who would lead the construction project for this town, and instructed him to do the inconceivable. "I want more villages like this, as many as you and the other architects can build. I want Tyrol to become a symbol of my power. I do not care the degree of funding and manpower you will need to accomplish this, just make sure that you do not cut any corners in the process." The architect looked at Berenger as if he was a madman. The expense to build a star fortress like this was no minor sum. To build these across all of Tyrol would easily cost a fortune. Nevertheless, Berenger was adamant, and despite the expense, he knew he could pay for it. This war across Germany was bound to last for years, and where there is war, there is profit to be made. With the new industrial sector of Innsbruck nearing completion, Berenger would have doubled the industrial power and could supply all the factions of this war with arms and armor necessary to maintain their armies. After seeing the daring expression in Berenger's eyes that appeared as if he was challenging the heavens with his ambitions, the architect gulped the saliva which had accumulated in his mouth and bowed his head respectfully to the young count. "Your Excellency, I will do as you command." With this, Berenger's plans to transform the entirety of the county of Tyrol into an impenetrable mountainous enclave had begun. Though it would take years, possibly even decades to complete, by the end of this ambitious initiative, one day in the distant future, the people of Tyrol would live in the most secure region of the world. A man with short dark hair in the form of a Caesar cut and emerald green eyes sat within the confines of his luxurious carriage. He was in his late 20s and quite handsome, so much so that he could give Berenger a run for his money. He had the regal features of a Roman patrician, and he wore lavish silk robes in the style that was common among the upper echelon of the aristocracy of the Byzantine Empire. Even though the German realm was currently in a state of total war, he had traveled across Europe for many months in an attempt to gain an audience with the man known as Berenger von Kufstein. Berenger had long since made use of the trade networks throughout Europe and the Mediterranean to acquire silk from the Byzantine Empire to fulfill the demands for his textile industry. However, his name did not carry much weight in the Eastern world. After all, even now as a count, he was not a significant figure in the world's affairs.
His most well-known quality was being declared as a heretic by the Catholic Church. Though the Orthodox Church was a separate branch of Christianity from the Catholics, they were still quite amicable with their Western brothers in this timeline. As such, being declared a heretic by the Catholic Church practically carried over to the Eastern Orthodox Church. Yet, the man in the carriage did not care about such details. Instead, he had a business proposal for Berenger in which he believed the young count could not refuse. The man arriving in Kufstein shortly was a powerful nobleman who held the equivalent position of a duke in the Byzantine aristocracy. Supposedly, Aretha's maniacs could trace his lineage to one of the greatest Roman emperors of all time, Aurelian. A man who was so profound, he quite possibly could have prevented the collapse of the Roman Empire if the treacherous Praetorian Guard had not assassinated him before his work was finished. Aretha's was in his own right an exemplary statesman and general, having personally led the charge into Egypt in years prior. He secured a foothold in the war against the Mamluk Sultanate, which currently held control over the region. However, despite his impressive victories that had allowed the Byzantines to acquire their advantage in Egypt, he could not believe the rumors he had heard about Berenger. If Berenger knew a powerful strategos of the Byzantine Empire was coming to meet him, he would have prepared a feast after all. Such a position was far higher than he currently held. Yet, the man decided to show up unannounced to test Berenger and his character. A nobleman from another region coming into your territory unannounced was a sign of disrespect, and this was not unknown to Aretha's. However, when the man laid his eyes on the intricate defenses of the city of Kufstein, he could not help but be impressed. Such mighty walls were comparable to the Theodosian walls of Constantinople, no. They might even be superior in defensive capabilities. After arriving at the checkpoint of the city's gates, Aretha's noticed that the garrison was all wearing a degree of plate armor and carrying strange weapons slung across their backs. Though he did not know how these weapons functioned and were less impressed with them, his attention was drawn to the impressive armor the troops wore. Just how wealthy was Berenger to equip all of his troops in plate armor? Even if it only covered their torso, back, neck, thighs, and head. It was enough to protect the vital points of their bodies without limiting mobility. The garrison allowed him to pass after hearing the man was a powerful representative from the Byzantine Empire. As such, his carriage and escort quickly rode into the city of Kufstein, which was filled with tenements, homes, shops, and all kinds of wonders. It was no longer a small agricultural town but a full-fledged city, though much of it was still undergoing construction. Despite being attracted by the nature of the city, which was much smaller than Constantinople, yet still was grand in its own right, the strategos made his way towards the castle, where the castle's guards abruptly stopped him. Aretha stepped out of the carriage and explained his reasoning for visiting. He spoke in German with a thick Greek accent, which did not go unnoticed by the sentries. I am Strategos Aretha's maniacs from the Byzantine Empire. I have come to discuss a business transition with the count of this region. Confused with the man's identity, the guards did not react at first. However, the man seemed to be dressed in luxurious clothing and possibly have a high standing in the Byzantine Empire. As such, they decided to let him pass, but only after confiscating the weapons from him and his guard. Berenger had become quite cautious ever since he took a hold of Tyrol. He would not allow armed visitors in his presence in fear that they might try to assassinate him. After all, his reforms were becoming quite unpopular among the nobility within Tyrol. Aretha's quickly agreed to these demands and had his guards disarm themselves before entering the castle's gates. When Aretha's entered the castle, he was not overly impressed after all. His palace was far more luxurious, of course. He did not know that the castle was only temporary living for Berenger at this point, while his grand palace, which was loosely based on the Schönbrunn Palace from his previous life, was being constructed. After entering the great hall, Aretha's witnessed Berenger sitting upon his seat of power, with his head resting on his fist. The young count was currently dressed in luxurious velvet attire in his house's black and gold color scheme. The clothing was, of course, based on Tudor fashion, and he even had a fur-lined sleeveless cloak over his exquisite doublet. A pair of jewels hung from his neck were made of gold and black garnet. While sitting upon his seat of power, Berenger exuded a sense of natural authority, so much so that even Aretha's, who held a far more prestigious position, could tell that Berenger was not a man to be trifled with. Before Aretha's could introduce himself to the fearsome count, Berenger noticed the man's approach into his great hall and gazed upon the man with a stoic expression while expressing his thoughts. "Who are you, and why should I care?"
Berengar was quite perturbed that his rest had been interrupted by an unknown man from the east. Berengar had been hard at work all day long, and his seat of power was one of the few places he could just sit back and allow his mind a proper recovery. Despite his minor irritation, he could immediately tell by the fashion in which the man wore that he was someone of great importance, yet he had arrived within Berengar's territory, in his home without announcing himself. The level of disrespect shown could not be understated. Seeing how Berengar reacted, Arethusa was quite shocked. The young count gazed upon him as if he was nothing of worth, and this was quite entertaining to the mighty strategos. As such, he boldly proclaimed his position within his own society and his intention for arriving. I am Strategos Arethusa Maniacs. I have traveled far from the borders of the Byzantine Emperor to seek an audience with your excellency. I have a business proposal that you may be interested in. Despite the rudeness in which the man had shown, Berengar was quite interested in two things. The man was essentially a duke within the mighty Byzantine Empire, and he had a business proposal for him. However, despite his interest, Berengar decided to return this man's kindness with an equally rude gesture. I am intrigued. However, I am currently busy and will need some time to prepare. Come back in 3 days. Ultimately, Berengar decided to snub the man for the time being. The level of disrespect he was shown had to be paid in kind before he could move forward. It was petty, but if he accepted this disrespect, it meant that any nobleman of higher birth could walk over him. As such, he decided to show his authority and sent the man back to the city below. In the meantime, Berengar had intended to verify this man's identity by inquiring about the so-called Strategos Arethusa Maniacs through his trade connections. Though Arethusa wanted to protest, the glaring sapphire eyes which belonged to the young count sent shivers down his spine. After all, he was disarmed and standing in his great hall, which was surrounded by a group of armed men. As such, Arethusa played it safe and decided to return to the city and rest for a few days before returning. On his way out of the castle, a wide grin appeared across the man's face as he expressed his thoughts aloud. Well played. Throughout the next couple of days, Arethusa spent his time going throughout the city of Kufstein and learning about its rapid progress. To think that less than a year ago, Kufstein could at most be considered an agricultural town. Though many regions of the city were still undergoing construction, the fact that the walls had been constructed and decent housing was provided for the area's citizens was astonishing to a man like Arethusa. The city's overall layout was constructed in a way that not only took security status in mind but also made certain districts in place that allowed for organized living. By far, the industrial district was the largest of these districts, and yet the trade district was a close second. The greatest part of Kufstein's design is that the walls extended far beyond the currently inhabited regions of the city, allowing for the potential of tens of thousands of more inhabitants to dwell within the city in the future. Of course, another series of walls could always be constructed, if the city grew beyond its current limits. Though the industrial district was largely closed off to visitors, seeing such a vast quantity of smoke in the air led Arethusa to believe that there was most definitely a massive industrial output created in this city. Though, of course, he would not believe the amount of steel produced every month in Kufstein if he were to hear the exact amount. Arethusa had initially come to Kufstein to secure an exclusive trade agreement with silk. After all, his personal territory grew vast quantities of the material, and he knew Berengar was expending a great sum to acquire it. However, seeing how well-equipped Berengar's garrison was, Arethusa believed he might be able to import a great deal of iron into the empire from Tyrol, which would greatly aid the forces of the empire. He had no way of knowing that the black and half-plate armor in which Berengar's forces wore was actually made out of quenched and tempered steel. After 3 days, the Byzantine nobleman returned to Berengar's castle and once more stood before him in the great hall. Berengar was the first to make conversation. I am Count Berengar von Kufstein. You are here in my territory and have arrived unannounced. Be grateful for my benevolence, for I have granted you an audience despite the disrespect you have shown me. Just because Arethusa was a man with a position similar to that of a duke did not mean that Berengar would back down. As such, he decided to emphasize that this meeting was solely due to his good nature and forgiveness. However, Arethusa did not seem fazed by Berengar's posturing and reintroduced himself with a great deal of confidence. I am Strategos Arethusa Maniacs. I have traveled a great distance to establish trade with your region. I know that you have a great desire for silk, and I have a large supply of such a material that I am willing to trade. I promise you that if you make me your exclusive trading partner in this regard, I will give you a decent discount on the materials and will be able to fulfill your demand. I have even brought a large quantity of raw silk for you to browse and see if its quality is up to your standards." Berenger smiled upon hearing the news that the other party had a large amount of silk to sell. Acquiring silk for his ever-increasing textile industry's demands was becoming more difficult, incurring a rising expense and a lower profit margin. As such, he was more than happy to negotiate on a price with the man. Thus Berenger got up from his seat and walked down the steps from the platform where his seat of power was placed upon before standing in front of the man face to face. Berenger was quite a deal taller than Aretha's, and as such, he was able to look down upon the man with a smug expression on his face. After arriving before the man, Berenger began to negotiate as he paced around Aretha's. "Assuming you can fulfill your words and satisfy the ever-growing demand for silk, I will be willing to deal exclusively with you under the conditions that I receive a 15% discount. However, I would very much like to see your product before I come to any agreement." As to Berenger, this was a reasonable request after all. He would be buying in vast quantities and wanted a bulk discount, and such a discount was more than reasonable from the standards of his previous life. Of course, he was willing to negotiate a minimum of 10% off. However, what surprised him was that Aretha's immediately agreed to his terms. "Such terms are acceptable to me. If you would like to browse my wares, we can go to the trade district in your city where I have left my supplies under the protection of my houseguard." Thus Berenger motioned for a group of his guards standing by to follow him and Aretha's into the city below, where they walked around for a bit, capturing the attention of the citizens who began to gossip about the scene. There were many rumors to be made about a lavishly dressed Eastern man conversing with Berenger, the Count of Tyrol. Berenger was well accustomed to such chatter. It was a common occurrence for the locals to gossip about him whenever he would take a stroll through the city, and as such, paid it no mind. Eventually, Aretha's and Berenger reached his carts, which contained a massive supply of raw silk cloth. Berenger carefully inspected the material to see any obvious flaws. After a lengthy period of time, he finally smiled and nodded his hand. "If you can supply this quantity and quality of silk at regular intervals, I believe we can agree." Aretha's returned Berenger's smile and stated with confidence that he would be able to meet his demands. "I can supply all of this and more every month. My merchant fleet can travel from Ionia to the Adriatic Sea, where they will then travel by caravan into Kufstein. As long as proper protection is provided for them when they enter through Austria, they will certainly arrive in Kufstein within that period of time." Berenger was instantly happy with this news. Finally, he could expand the trade of the more luxurious textiles and for a decent markup. His profit margins would increase with this deal, and he was pleased with it. After shaking the man's hand, Berenger invited Aretha's to share a meal with him in his castle. "How about you stay in my castle for dinner tonight? I promise you that you will not regret the fine cuisine of Tyrol." After hearing the young count's offer, Aretha's nodded his head in agreement. After all, the more friendly he became with Berenger, the more likely he could get his hands on some of his iron. As such, the shipment of silk was brought to Berenger's textile factories, where it would be converted into velvet and designed into fashionable clothing. Gold exchanged hands between the strategos and the young count. Eventually, they returned to the castle to share a meal to celebrate the new lucrative trade between their two territories. Unknowingly, this trade agreement would have important effects on the future of this world and the relationship between the rising German Empire and the Byzantines to the east. A small feast was thrown within the confines of the castle of Kufstein. Sitting at the head of the table was Berenger, and by his side was Linda. At the table near Linda's position was Henrietta. The only other people present at the table were Aretha's and a variety of Byzantine merchants and noblemen who traveled with his caravan. These men were allowed to dine at the table this night as a show of friendship to the Byzantines. Berenger was quite pleased that the Byzantine Empire maintained significant control over the Mediterranean in this timeline. In contrast, during his past life, they were on the brink of destruction at this point in history. This made establishing trade with the East much easier than dealing with a powerful Muslim empire. Even though the Byzantines were Orthodox, they were much more amicable in this world to the Catholics in the West than they were in their previous life, and as such, the two men were able to get along quite well. Especially because Berenger was secretly an atheist and had no plans to discriminate based upon what religion someone might adhere to. For the rest of the medieval world, this open-mindedness was uncommon, to say the least. Aretha's and the merchants were dining on a variety of German cuisine, which Berenger had long since introduced into Kufstein and by now had spread across Austria and into Bavaria. The Byzantines were far more culturally advanced than their Western counterparts due to them being the surviving remnant of the ancient Roman Empire. Because of this, they were quite shocked that such a high level of culinary talent was available in a remote region like Tyrol. Seeing the satisfied expression on Aretha's face as he dug into the veal schnitzel, Berenger could not prevent himself from asking about the man's opinion.
"So, what do you think about Tyrolean cuisine?"
After being asked such a question, Aretha slowly chewed on the food and savored its taste before washing it down with a Doppelbock beer. Since Berenger first established his breweries, the first batch of Doppelbock beer had recently been released. As a beer connoisseur, Berenger was quite pleased with the result. It was apparent by the look on the Byzantine nobleman's face that he was not the only one who enjoyed the hearty taste of the strong German beer. It was only after several moments had passed and Aretha's had time to enjoy the serving he had just devoured that he was able to answer Berenger's question.
"Truly, it is sublime.
I have not had such a fantastic foreign meal in years.
The last time I had such an exquisite dish from a foreign country was when I visited India."
Growing up in a globalized world from his previous life, Berenger was quite accustomed to Eastern-style foods. He was a big fan of curry from various countries, including India as such. His mouth salivated thinking about having a curried rice dish. Berenger had once experimented with eating curried rice with tortilla chips in his previous life, acting as if the rice dish was a dip. It turned out to be quite tasty, at least in his opinion. Of course, everyone else thought he was a weirdo for doing such a thing. Thinking about such memories, Berenger could not wait for the point where he acquired some coastal territory to build a great fleet that could sail across Asia and acquire the spices necessary to recreate some of his favorite dishes from the continent. However, he was stuck in a landlocked region for now, and unless he expanded through force or coercion, he would not be able to acquire such valuable territory.
Both of those options took time to prepare for.
Aretha's had his eyes on Linda for quite some time now. After all, she was an exceptional beauty, and as such, he could not stop himself from praising her.
"Berenger, your wife is among the gorgeous women I have ever seen. You are a lucky man."
Hearing herself be referred to as Berenger's wife, Linda began to blush as she shifted her attention to the food on the table.
Berenger chuckled at Aretha's comment.
However, he did not intend to spoil Linda's fun, and as such, did not clarify that she was, in fact, his lover, not his wife. "Linda is the mother of my child and the companion of my heart, as you say. I am truly a lucky man to have her by my side." Seeing as how Berenger did not correct Aretha's, Linda decided to play the part of a dutiful wife and made her stance clear. "Berenger is the only man I will ever love. It is I who am grateful to be afforded the privilege to live by his side." Seeing the genuine expression on the exquisite young woman's face, Aretha's mistook them for a happy newlywed couple and decided to shift the topic to something more important. "Berenger, I do not intend to be rude, so forgive me if I am out of place, but I noticed a great deal of smoke rising from your industrial sector. I have also noticed your men are all equipped in plate armor.
If you could humor my curiosity, just how much iron is produced in this city?"
With this question being raised, Berenger chuckled once more, though this time it was a bit more noticeable, and as such, Aretha's frowned before asking Berenger.
"What is so funny?"
A proud smile appeared on Berenger's face as he began to correct the man. "It is not iron in which my army is equipped with, but steel. My industrial sector produces a massive output of steel every month. The exact amount would shock you.
Let's just say that I have more steel than I know what to do with at the moment."
This was not an exaggeration in the slightest. With the new territory gained in his conquests and the city of Innsbruck being industrialized, Berenger was producing thousands of tons of steel every month, and despite using the steel in his many construction projects, which ranged from building fortifications, sewage treatment centers, roads, etc., as well as its extensive use in his arms industry, which supplied not only his own forces with the advanced equipment they wielded but also the
medieval arms and armor of his allies,
Berenger still had quite the surplus, albeit the more ambitious his plans became, the more the surplus dwindled. Hearing this information, Aretha's instantly became excited by the news. Though he could not fathom how, if Berenger truly possessed the ability to create such a terrifying amount of steel, then clearly he could buy some of the raw materials for his own armies. As such, he began to ponder about the feasibility of such a deal.
Is it possible for me to purchase some of your surplus?
A smirk spread across Berenger's lips as he heard those words. Not only could he produce arms and armor for the factions fighting for Germany, but with this opportunity, he could partially supply the Byzantine armies who were fighting in Egypt. If negotiated properly, he could increase the business of his arms trade without putting his own position in danger. After all, no matter what type of armor he produced for the Byzantines, it would never stop his muskets, especially not the rifled muskets that utilized mini-balls. Thus Berenger had no fear of trading arms and armor to the east. Seeing that Berenger was talking about business at the dinner table, the other merchants instantly became enlightened by the idea of purchasing some steel to be brought back to the empire for resale. As such, Berenger found himself bombarded with offers. However, before it could get too chaotic, he raised his hand, signaling the men to behave themselves.
We are enjoying a meal right now. There will be plenty of time to discuss business opportunities in the upcoming days. Take this time to savor the dishes on the table, and think about what offers you wish to present me. What Berenger said was true. They had gotten ahead of themselves after the excitement they felt upon hearing that Berenger had a vast surplus of steel. After all, it was a tough material to make in this era, and only ever in small quantities. If Berenger truly possessed such a stockpile of the valuable material, they would be willing to go to great lengths to secure a trade agreement with the young count. As such, the remainder of the dinner was spent discussing less important matters and the ongoing events of the world. For a region embroiled in warfare, Tyrol was remarkably secure for the moment. Thus, while the rest of Germany suffered through the hardships of war, Berenger entertained a host of Byzantine merchants and noblemen from the east. After the feast was over, Berenger saw his guests off to the quarters they were staying in his city. He had made quite an impression on these Byzantine noblemen and merchants, and in the following days, would make sure to negotiate proper trade agreements with every one of them. The more contacts he made in the east, the better his business would become. After reclaiming much of their lost territories since the Crusades had begun, the Byzantine Empire was wealthy, far more than a region like Germany. After all, they were in the center of trade between the west and the east. Though the Byzantines had to repel Saracen invasions a couple of times a decade, for the most part, their power was stable, and Berenger saw an opportunity in building relations with them. As such, he made sure to take care of his guests during this feast. After sending the men off, he returned to his castle, where he sat down and had a glass of wine alongside his beautiful young lover. The wine was a gift from the Byzantine Empire and was of significant quality, thus Berenger wanted to have a taste of it. After swirling the wine around in his chalice and inhaling the thick aroma, Berenger sipped upon the fine alcohol before nodding his head in approval. The Byzantines sure know how to make a good wine. On the other hand, Linda had some questions on her mind and was not afraid to speak of them. As such, she quickly asked Berenger about his intentions. You sure seem to be treating these men from the east quite well. Do you intend to establish an arms trade with the Byzantines? Berenger smiled and nodded his head before explaining his plans. The eastern half of the Roman Empire was always its wealthiest region, with much of their lands reclaimed. The Byzantines have amassed quite a fortune over the previous centuries. Due to being near the Saracens, they are constantly under threat of invasion and spend a large amount of wealth on their military. Now that they know I have a substantial supply of steel, when they return to the east and spread the news of this, the generals of the Byzantine armies will be begging me to supply their forces with high-quality equipment. Berenger estimated that the Byzantines would most likely be victorious in their ongoing war with Egypt and reap great spoils from the region, further increasing their wealth. As such, he intended to get on their good side and make as much money from their wars as possible. Wars were a profitable business to those who had the means to take advantage of them. Linda carefully observed Berenger's estimation before nodding her head in agreement. What Berenger said was most likely true, and getting in the good graces of the Byzantine Empire provided substantial benefits. As such, she complimented him on his schemes. You really think everything through, don't you? Berenger chuckled as he took a swig from his glass of wine before responding. Not everything, but I try to be a few steps ahead of my potential rivals. Make no mistake, in the future, when I have united my German Empire, the Byzantines will be a rival for global hegemony. At the rate they are expanding, they could become a threat if relations are not properly maintained. Luckily for Berenger, he knew about the New World and the resource-rich regions of Africa, most of which were sparsely populated and posed no major threat to an advanced army like his own.
After unifying his empire, he would take advantage of his knowledge and lay claim to the best regions in the world for colonization. By the time the Byzantine Empire and the other powers realized the value of these regions, the critical areas would already be under German sovereignty. Linda saw the proud expression on Berenger's face but could not read his mind, and as such, did not know what he was smirking about. However, she knew when it came to Berenger and his ambitions that it was best not to overstep her bounds, and as such, she decided to switch the topic. "So, will you be showing the merchants your steel stockpile?" Snapping back to reality from Linda's words, Berenger quickly nodded his head in response and smiled once more. "Of course. They need to know just how much I can produce so that they can brag to the Empire about my steel surplus. The greater the surplus, the larger the interest the Empire will have for my steel. I will show them the extent of my people's labor tomorrow. It will be sure to leave a lasting impression on these merchants and noblemen from the East." With that said, the two lovers quickly finished their wine before returning to their bedchambers, where they embraced each other passionately for many hours into the long night. After the sun rose in the morning, Berenger got up and began his daily routine. It was well past noon when he finally met with Arethas and the others in the city below. After meeting up with Arethas, Berenger patted the man on the back with a wide grin on his face. "Come. Let me show you the extent of my industry." Hearing these words, a flash of greed filled the eyes of the merchants from the east who surrounded Berenger like a flock of hungry buzzards. Berenger knew what they were thinking about from the gleam in their pupils. Unfortunately for them, he would not allow them to see the machinery used to create such a massive stockpile of steel, only the results of production. As such, Berenger led the men through the industrial district of Kufstein, whose secrets were heavily guarded by the garrison. Only properly authorized personnel was allowed through the gates, but since these men traveled with Berenger, they were easily able to pass by the strict security. After all, Berenger owned this entire city. Berenger made sure to give the men a tour of the industrial district outside of the critical areas of development. As such, the armories and arms factories were the first he showed. Of course, he showed the factories which explicitly produced equipment for export, not the manufacture of his own supplies. Seeing such a large warehouse filled with hundreds of employees working in well-organized assembly lines to create sets of brigandine and plate armor, the Byzantine merchants were shocked by the size of the operation. Berenger smiled smugly at the expressions on their faces before introducing the area. "This is the armory, where we manufacture brigandine and plate armor for export to our customers. Of course, if you desire a different armor style, we could also manufacture that for you. From my understanding, the Byzantine army uses a mixture of mail and mirror pattern armor, and I would be more than happy to craft such equipment if an agreement can be reached." Mirror pattern armor was a style of armor used by Eastern forces. It consisted of a group of interlocking iron plates, usually in the form of circles and squares, which protected the torso. These plates were grouped together by rivet mail rings. Generally speaking, the mirror pattern armor was worn over a mail hauberk. Berenger produced very little mail armor because it was a time-consuming practice, far more so than brigandine and plate. He would honestly prefer to introduce this Western style of equipment to the Byzantine forces, but that was not his decision to make. Seeing the grand scale of equipment production, Arethas felt the need to ask about where such supplies would be sold off to. "Just who is your customer for such a large supply of equipment?" Berenger smiled and did not hide that this equipment was custom-ordered and paid for by the Duke of Austria and his vassals. "My largest customer at the moment is Count Otto of Steiermark. However, Duke Wilmar has recently begun placing orders for his personal armies as well. Luckily for him, he came into a large supply of weapons and armor from the late Count Lothar and his armies. Due to the size and speed of my industry, he has given me the task of repairing and outfitting the equipment for his purposes. However, a lot of this is also new production. As the war goes on, the demand for more equipment expands." The sight of the armory left a lasting impression on Arethas, and he could hardly believe his eyes. Of course, when the Byzantine noblemen and merchants arrived at their next destination, they would be equally shocked by the scale of industry in which Berenger had fostered in Kufstein. If the mighty strategos knew that Kufstein was just one of Berenger's industrial cities and that Innsbruck had been developing its own industrial sector, he would truly lose his mind in astonishment.